You blink. The heavy wooden door slams shut behind you with the finality of a coffin lid. The smell hits first. Urine, unwashed bodies, and something else you can't quite place but desperately wish you couldn't smell. Welcome to Bethlehem Royal Hospital, 1885, or as the locals call it, Bedlam. The Victorian era wasn't exactly known for its progressive mental health care. In fact, calling it care would be rather generous. You've just been committed to what might be the closest thing to hell on earth, and you haven't even said a word yet. But before we dive into exactly why you'd be absolutely buggered in this situation, smash that like button and subscribe for more historical nightmares that'll make you grateful for modern life. Trust me, you'll need the comfort of knowing you can click away from this madness. Right then, let's see just how quickly Victorian England would break you, shall we? The iron gates have locked behind you, the admission papers have been signed, and your old life has just evaporated like morning mist. You're about to discover that in 1885, the difference between patient and prisoner was purely semantic. The Victorians had some rather creative ideas about treating mental illness, and spoiler alert, none of them involved actually getting better. Your journey into this particular circle of hell is about to begin, and each step will reveal another delightful reason why surviving even a day in this place would be nothing short of miraculous. Ready to see how long you'd last? Let's find out. 1. You'd be diagnosed before saying a word. You step through the entrance hall of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and congratulations, you're already mad. Not because you've done anything particularly insane, mind you, but because you've committed the cardinal sin of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Victorian medical establishment had a rather efficient approach to psychiatric diagnosis. If you were here, you belonged here, circular logic at its finest. The admitting physician barely glances up from his leather-bound ledger as you're escorted into his cramped office. Dr. Pemberton, a man whose credentials consist of a medical degree from Edinburgh and an unshakable belief in his own brilliance, has already made his assessment. You see, Victorian doctors possessed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mental illness through what they called physiognomy, the art of reading character from facial features. Lovely system, really. Your slightly furrowed brow suggests moral degeneracy. Your direct eye contact indicates dangerous delusions of equality, and that nervous fidgeting, classic signs of hysteria, obviously. The good doctor dips his quill and begins scribbling your fate in his remarkably neat handwriting. Subject exhibits clear signs of nervous excitement upon admission, he mutters, completely ignoring the fact that anyone would be nervous when being locked up in what amounts to a human zoo. Demonstrates inappropriate composure, suggesting hidden mania, because apparently staying calm proves you're mad, but being upset would prove you're mad too. Rather convenient how that works out. You haven't spoken a word yet, but your file is already growing thicker. Dr. Pemberton notes your shifty eyes. You glanced at the barred window, and your defensive posture. You crossed your arms when he started examining you like a prize heifer. Every natural human reaction becomes evidence of your madness. It's almost impressive how efficiently they've rigged the system. The Victorian era was particularly fond of diagnosing women with hysteria, a catch-all condition that could be triggered by reading too much, having opinions, or simply being female in public. Men weren't exempt either. They could be diagnosed with moral insanity for everything from gambling to questioning authority. The beauty of Victorian psychiatry was its simplicity. If you didn't fit their narrow definition of proper behavior, you were mentally ill. No need for complicated assessments or second opinions. Your silence during this examination isn't helping your case. Dr. Pemberton interprets your quiet observation as sullen withdrawal, another textbook symptom of mental derangement. He makes another note, his pen scratching across the parchment with the sound of a death sentence being written. You're trapped in a catch-22 that would make Kafka weep. Speak up, and you're agitated. Stay quiet, and you're withdrawn. There's literally no winning move in this particular game. The doctor finally looks up at you, his pale eyes studying your face with the intensity of a lepidopterist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Pupils dilated, he observes, completely ignoring the fact that the room is dimly lit by a single oil lamp, clear indication of nervous stimulation. He makes another mark in your file. At this rate, you'll have accumulated enough symptoms for 3 different mental illnesses before tea time. Victorian medical professionals had an alarming confidence in their ability to spot madness at a glance. They believed that mental illness was written across the face like a book, and they were all apparently excellent readers. Never mind that their diagnostic manual consisted mainly of prejudices disguised as science. A prominent forehead suggested criminal tendencies, close-set eyes indicated moral weakness. And if you happened to be poor, well, that was practically a diagnosis in itself. The truly maddening part, if you'll pardon the expression, is how scientifically they approached this pseudo-science. They measured skulls with calipers, compared jaw angles to established charts, and recorded every observation with meticulous care. The fact that their methods were complete rubbish didn't diminish their enthusiasm for documentation. Your file would eventually contain detailed notes about your cranial abnormalities and degenerate physiognomy, creating a paper trail that would follow you for the rest of your short, miserable life. Dr. Pemberton continues his assessment, noting that you seem unusually alert for a patient of your condition. The fact that you're paying attention to your surroundings apparently suggests a suspicious level of awareness. In the Victorian mindset, truly mad people were supposed to be obviously mad, drooling, raving, completely detached from reality. Your inconvenient sanity just proves how cunningly your madness has manifested itself. The irony would be delicious if it weren't so terrifying. The more rational you appear, the more irrational they assume you must be underneath. It's like being accused of witchcraft. Your denial just proves you're a particularly sneaky witch. The Victorians had perfected the art of the unfalsifiable hypothesis decades before Karl Popper would explain why that was a problem. Your clothing receives scrutiny next. Too neat, and you're obsessively particular. Too disheveled, and you're obviously incapable of self-care. The middle ground apparently doesn't exist in Victorian psychiatry. Dr. Pemberton makes a note about your inappropriate attention to appearance, because maintaining basic hygiene is apparently suspicious behavior in someone supposedly mad enough to require institutional care. The social class dimension of Victorian asylum admission was particularly brutal. If you were wealthy, your family might have you quietly committed to a private facility where you'd be treated with slightly more dignity while still being subjected to the same medieval treatments. If you were poor, you'd end up in places like Bethlehem, where conditions would make a medieval dungeon look like a spa retreat. Your accent, your clothing, even your posture all contribute to Dr. Pemberton's assessment of your particular brand of madness. The doctor finally sets down his pen and regards you with the satisfied expression of a job well done. In the span of 5 minutes, without hearing you speak or asking about your background, he's managed to diagnose you with nervous hysteria, moral insanity, and suspicious sanity, a trifecta of Victorian psychiatric conditions that would make even the most creative modern diagnostician impressed. Your fate has been sealed by nothing more than existing in his presence. But here's where things get properly interesting. Your diagnosis isn't just a medical opinion, it's a legal declaration that strips you of virtually every right you thought you had. You can't vote, you can't own property, you can't even legally refuse treatment. With a few scratches of his pen, Dr. Pemberton has effectively erased you from society. You're no longer a person with a mental health issue, you're a mental health issue that happens to inhabit a person-shaped vessel. The truly chilling realization creeps over you as Dr. Pemberton closes your file with a satisfied snap. This isn't the beginning of your treatment, it's the end of your life as you knew it. Everything from this moment forward will be filtered through the lens of your diagnosed madness. Smile, and you're displaying inappropriate affect. Cry, and you're confirming your emotional instability. Argue, and you're being combative. Accept, and you're showing dangerous compliance. The attendant at the door, a burly man with the sympathetic demeanor of a Victorian tax collector, steps forward with a set of keys that jangle like wind chimes in a hurricane. Your brief interview with Dr. Pemberton is over, and your real education in Victorian asylum life is about to begin. You've been processed, catalogued, and diagnosed without saying a single word. As you're led away from the doctor's office, the full weight of your situation begins to settle in like fog rolling across the Thames. You came through that door as a person with problems. You're leaving as a problem with a person attached. The transformation is complete, and it happened so quickly you barely noticed the metamorphosis. But your journey into this particular heart of darkness has only just begun. The diagnosis was merely the appetizer in a feast of horrors that would make Dante reconsider his career in infernal tourism. Next comes your introduction to your new home, a place where the architecture was designed by someone who clearly believed that human misery was best served in brick and mortar, with a side of complete sensory assault. 2. You'd be shoved into the quiet room, which isn't quiet. The attendant's keys rattle like chains dragging across cobblestones as he leads you down a corridor that seems designed by someone with a deep personal grudge against human comfort. The walls are bare brick, painted that peculiar shade of institutional green that makes sick people look sicker and sane people question their grip on reality. Welcome to your new accommodation, though calling it accommodation would be rather like calling a coffin a bedroom. Right then, the attendant grunts, selecting a key from his impressive collection. Quiet room for you, love. Doctor's orders. He says this with the casual air of someone offering you tea and biscuits, completely ignoring the symphony of human misery echoing from behind every door you've passed. Quiet room, that's what they're calling it. You'd laugh if the situation weren't so utterly dire. The heavy wooden door swings open with a groan that sounds suspiciously like the last breath of hope leaving your body. Your new home is a masterpiece of Victorian efficiency, a brick cell roughly 6 feet by 8 feet with all the charm of a medieval dungeon, but none of the historical significance. The walls are stained with substances you desperately hope are just dirt and damp, though your nose suggests otherwise. There's no mattress. There's barely furniture. In one corner sits what might charitably be called a bed, a wooden platform with a thin layer of straw that looks like it was last changed during the Crimean War. The straw rustles with movement that you pray is just settling, though that scratching sound suggests you're about to become intimately acquainted with some very active roommates of the six-legged variety. The attendant gestures grandly toward your palatial accommodations. There's your spot then. Dinner's at 6, assuming you're still sane enough to eat. He chuckles at his own wit, apparently finding the concept of sanity in this place absolutely hilarious. The door slams shut behind him with a finality that makes your earlier diagnosis seem like the pleasant part of your day. And then the real education begins. The quiet room isn't quiet. It's never been quiet. The name is either Victorian irony at its finest, or a cruel joke that's been running for decades. From 3 cells down comes a rhythmic banging that sounds like someone repeatedly throwing themselves against a brick wall, which, considering your current circumstances, they probably are. The sound echoes through the corridor with metronomic precision, bang, pause, creating a tempo that will slowly drive you mad even if you arrived completely sane. From the cell to your left comes a voice muttering what sounds like Latin prayers mixed with creative profanity in at least 3 languages. The voice rises and falls in waves, occasionally breaking into what might be singing, if singing could sound like a cat being slowly strangled. You try to ignore it, but the walls are thin enough that you can hear every word, every breath, every disturbing pause that suggests your neighbor might be planning something you'd rather not contemplate. The cell to your right contains someone who apparently believes they're conducting an orchestra made entirely of invisible instruments. You can hear them tapping, humming, and occasionally shouting instructions to musicians who exist only in their fractured imagination. "More viola, you idiots!" echoes through the wall, followed by what sounds like applause for a performance only they can hear. Victorian asylums were designed on the principle that isolation would somehow cure madness, a theory that worked about as well as you'd expect. The reality was that solitary confinement in these conditions didn't cure anything. It created new problems faster than it solved old ones. You're experiencing firsthand what happens when you take someone who might have been struggling with manageable issues and lock them in a box with nothing but their own thoughts and the disturbing sounds of human misery. The straw beneath you shifts and rustles with every movement, and you're becoming increasingly certain that you're sharing your sleeping arrangements with a thriving ecosystem of Victorian insects. Something small and definitely alive scurries across your hand, and you resist the urge to scream, partly because screaming would confirm your madness, but mostly because you're not sure you'd be able to stop once you started. The smell in your quiet room is a complex bouquet of human despair seasoned with centuries of poor sanitation. There's the metallic tang of blood from whatever previous occupant decided that self-harm was preferable to another day in paradise. There's the sweet, sick smell of infection from wounds that never received proper treatment. And underneath it all, there's the pervasive odor of fear sweat that seems to have soaked into the very bricks themselves. Your window, if you can call a 6-inch gap near the ceiling a window, provides a view of absolutely nothing except a small patch of grey sky that might as well be the surface of the moon for all the good it does you. The glass is thick, barred, and so dirty that even on the sunniest day, your cell would feel like the bottom of a coal mine. The Victorians apparently believed that fresh air and natural light were luxury items that the mentally ill didn't deserve. As night falls, the sounds from your neighboring cells take on a different quality. The banging becomes more frantic, the muttering more urgent, and the invisible orchestra apparently decides to perform what sounds like a death march, composed entirely of percussion instruments. Sleep becomes not just impossible but genuinely dangerous. The rhythmic noises create a hypnotic effect that makes you question whether you're still awake or trapped in some fever dream. The cold seeps through the brick walls like a living thing, settling into your bones with the patience of someone who knows you're not going anywhere. Victorian heating technology apparently stopped at the concept of pile on more blankets, except you don't have blankets. You have straw that's gradually losing its battle against gravity and dampness, leaving you with what amounts to a thin layer of decomposing vegetation between you and the stone floor. By your second hour in the quiet room, you begin to understand why the previous occupant left those mysterious stains on the wall. The complete sensory assault, the sounds, smells, cold, and isolation, creates a perfect storm of psychological pressure that would crack even the most stable mind. The Victorians had accidentally discovered that the most effective way to drive someone insane was to lock them in a room designed specifically to maximize human misery. The scratching in the walls becomes more pronounced as the night progresses. Something is definitely alive in there, and it's either very large or there are very many of them. The sound of tiny claws on brick joins the symphony of madness that serves as your lullaby. You find yourself listening to the rhythm, trying to predict the patterns, and realize with growing horror that you're already adapting to this nightmare. Every few hours, footsteps echo down the corridor as attendants make their rounds, but they don't stop to check on anyone's welfare. They're just counting bodies to make sure no one's managed to escape their earthly torment without permission. The footsteps pause at your door, just long enough for you to hope for human contact, then move on without so much as a word. The isolation is as complete as it is devastating. The banging from 3 cells down suddenly stops, leaving a silence so profound it's almost worse than the noise. You strain to hear any sign of life, any indication that your fellow prisoner hasn't finally succumbed to the relentless pressure of existence in this place. But there's nothing, just the continued muttering from your left and the ongoing invisible concert from your right, creating a stereo effect of madness that surrounds you like a fog. As dawn approaches, though you can barely tell through your pathetic excuse for a window, you realize that you've survived your first night in the quiet room. Survived might be too strong a word. You've endured it. You've existed through it. Whether you've remained sane is already becoming a question with a very uncertain answer. The straw beneath you has compressed into something resembling concrete, and your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. Your throat is raw from breathing air that tastes like despair mixed with industrial cleaning products. Your eyes burn from strain, trying to see in darkness so complete it feels solid. And then, just as you're beginning to think the worst is behind you, you hear the sound of keys rattling in the corridor, not the casual jangle of routine rounds, but the purposeful march of someone with a job to do. The footsteps stop directly outside your door, and you hear the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into the lock. The door opens and the attendant's silhouette fills the frame like a harbinger of fresh hell. Right then, he announces with cheerful malice, "Time for your bath." 3. You'd be given a bath you definitely didn't ask for. The word bath conjures images of warmth, cleanliness, and perhaps a moment of peaceful solitude. Forget every pleasant association you've ever had with that word, because Victorian Asylum hydrotherapy was about as relaxing as being keelhauled by a particularly vindictive pirate crew. The attendant's grin suggests he knows exactly what fresh hell awaits you, and he's genuinely looking forward to watching your reaction. You're marched down another corridor, this one featuring the delightful addition of puddles that squelch under your feet with the consistency of things you'd rather not contemplate. The walls here are slick with condensation and decorated with a patina of mold that probably has its own ecosystem. The smell hits you before you even reach the bathing room, a combination of wet stone, carbolic acid, and the lingering aroma of human terror. The bathing room is a cathedral of Victorian medical sadism, complete with multiple tubs that look suspiciously like medieval torture devices. They're made of cast iron, stained with rust, and substances that definitely aren't rust, and positioned in the center of the room like altars to the god of therapeutic suffering. Around each tub stand various attendants, orderlies, and what appears to be a small audience of medical students who've come to observe the show. Right then, off with the clothes, barks the head attendant, a woman whose expression suggests she's seen enough naked lunatics to stock a particularly disturbing art gallery. Mrs. Grimsby, her name tag reads like a warning, has the build of someone who's spent years wrestling unwilling patients into submission. She points toward the nearest tub with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. The water in the tub is a temperature that can only be described as maliciously cold. Steam doesn't rise from its surface because steam requires heat, and heat apparently doesn't exist in Victorian hydrotherapy. The Victorians believed that shock to the system would jar patients back to sanity, operating on the medical principle that if something was unpleasant enough, it must be therapeutic. By that logic, being repeatedly struck by lightning should cure absolutely everything. But here's where things get properly interesting. You're not getting this bath alone. Privacy was apparently considered a luxury that the mentally ill didn't deserve, so your therapeutic experience will be supervised by no fewer than 6 strangers, all taking notes on your reaction to their prescribed treatment. Medical students cluster around like vultures, their notebooks ready to record every detail of your humiliation for posterity. The attendants grab you with practiced efficiency, and you quickly discover that resistance isn't just futile, it's diagnostic, struggle, and they'll note your violent tendencies, submit quietly, and they'll record your dangerous compliance. There's literally no response that won't be used as evidence of your mental deficiency. The Victorians had turned patient abuse into a science, complete with detailed documentation and theoretical justification. The moment your body hits that water, every nerve in your system screams in protest. This isn't cold, This is the kind of temperature that makes you question whether hypothermia might actually be preferable to whatever they're calling treatment. Your muscles seize, your breath catches, and your brain temporarily forgets how to process sensory information that isn't pure, crystallized agony. "Excellent response," murmurs Dr. Pemberton, who's appeared to observe your therapeutic experience. "Note the immediate muscular tension and respiratory distress, classic indicators of the nervous system responding to corrective stimulus." He's describing your body's completely normal reaction to being dunked in ice water, as if he's discovered something profound about the nature of madness. The water level rises as more ice-cold liquid is poured in from metal buckets that look like they've been borrowed from a medieval dungeon. The attendants push you down into the tub with the gentle care of someone stuffing a turkey, ensuring that the water reaches your neck. Your body has now moved beyond cold into that special realm of temperature that feels like being stabbed by thousands of tiny frozen needles. Mrs. Grimsby produces what she optimistically calls soap, a grey, gritty substance that smells like it was made from the ashes of hope mixed with industrial cleaning chemicals. She begins scrubbing you with a brush that feels like it was designed for removing barnacles from ship hulls. The combination of freezing water and aggressive scrubbing creates a sensory experience that would make professional torture specialists take notes. "Hydrotherapy," explains Dr. Pemberton to his gaggle of medical students, "works by shocking the patient's system out of its delusional state. The cold water stimulates circulation, while the supervised bathing process reinforces the patient's return to civilized behavior." He says this while you're sitting naked in freezing water being scrubbed raw by someone who clearly learned her technique from professional horse groomers. The truly maddening part is how scientifically they approach this torture. They time your exposure to the cold, measure your pulse, and record your verbal responses, though screaming apparently doesn't count as meaningful communication. Every aspect of your suffering is carefully documented, as if your misery were a fascinating natural phenomenon worthy of academic study. The medical students scribble frantically in their notebooks, capturing every detail of your ordeal for future reference. "Note the patient's cyanotic skin tone," one observes, apparently fascinated by the fact that prolonged exposure to ice water makes people turn blue. "And observe the chattering of teeth, clear indication of the nervous system attempting to regulate temperature. Revolutionary medical insights, truly." After what feels like several geological epochs but is probably only 15 minutes, they decide you've had enough therapeutic benefit for one session. The attendants haul you out of the tub with all the gentleness of dock workers unloading cargo, and you discover that getting out of the ice bath is somehow worse than being in it. Your skin burns as blood slowly returns to your extremities, creating a sensation like being set on fire from the inside out. The towels they provide are about as absorbent as parchment paper and roughly as soft as tree bark. Mrs. Grimsby throws one at you with the casual indifference of someone feeding pigeons, then stands back to watch you attempt to dry yourself with what amounts to a decorative rag. The towel is already damp from previous use, because apparently clean, dry towels were another luxury reserved for people who weren't considered mentally defective. Your skin is now an attractive shade of mottled purple, and you're shivering so violently that the medical students are taking additional notes about involuntary muscular spasms. Pemberton nods with satisfaction, apparently convinced that your body's desperate attempt to prevent hypothermia is evidence of therapeutic progress. But the real horror of Victorian hydrotherapy wasn't just the immediate suffering, it was the complete degradation of human dignity wrapped in medical terminology. They'd taken the simple act of bathing and transformed it into a public spectacle of humiliation. Every natural response to their treatment became evidence of your mental illness, creating a feedback loop of suffering that would make Sisyphus feel grateful for his comparatively simple boulder rolling assignment. The water in the tub is now tinged with blood from where the scrub brush has abraded your skin, and floating debris that you desperately hope is just dirt from previous patients. The sight of it makes you realize that you've just been bathed in water that's probably seen dozens of other patients, because changing the water between uses would apparently be an unnecessary expense. As you stand there dripping and shaking, wearing nothing but goosebumps and existential dread, Dr. Pemberton makes his final notes. Patient shows excellent responsiveness to hydrotherapeutic intervention, he announces. Recommend continuation of treatment at regular intervals. In other words, this nightmare is going to be a recurring feature of your stay at the asylum. The attendants provide you with a fresh set of institutional clothing, grey, shapeless garments that smell like they've been laundered in despair and pressed with disappointment. The fabric feels like it was woven from processed cardboard, and it's still slightly damp from its own recent encounter with the asylum's washing facilities. As you're led back toward the corridor, still shivering and aching from your therapeutic experience, you catch a glimpse of the next patient being prepared for their turn in the tubs. The look of dawning horror on their face is all too familiar. It's the same expression you wore just minutes ago when you discovered that Victorian medical care bore no resemblance to actual healing. The sound of splashing and shocked screaming echoes behind you as you're marched back toward your accommodations, a grim reminder that your suffering is neither unique nor finished. In the Victorian Asylum system, your pain was just another data point in their grand experiment in human misery disguised as medical treatment. But your education in institutional living is far from complete. You've survived your diagnosis, endured your quiet room, and experienced the particular hell of Victorian hydrotherapy. Now it's time to meet your fellow inmates and discover that the company you'll be keeping might be even more challenging than the treatments you'll be receiving. 4. You'd be assigned a roommate who definitely bites. The dormitory is a long, narrow room lined with iron bedsteads that look like they were designed by someone who'd heard beds described, but never actually seen one. Each bed is separated from its neighbors by roughly 3 feet of space, just enough room to swing a cat, assuming you had a cat and were inclined toward animal cruelty. The mattresses are thin pallets of straw that have been compressed into something resembling fossilized misery. Privacy in a Victorian asylum was about as common as vegetarian options at a medieval feast. The attendants march you toward what they generously call the dormitory, though calling it that would be like calling a shipwreck a luxury cruise. You're about to discover that sharing space with other patients isn't just uncomfortable, it's a masterclass in survival skills you never knew you'd need. Right then, there's your spot, announces the attendant, pointing to a bed that's currently occupied by a man who appears to be having an animated conversation with the ceiling. Bertram's been here longest, so he gets first pick of everything. Play nice? Now, the attendant's tone suggests that playing nice might be more of a survival technique than a social courtesy. Bertram turns his attention from the ceiling to you, and his smile reveals teeth that have clearly lost their battle with Victorian dental hygiene. His eyes have the particular gleam that suggests he's seeing things the rest of us aren't, and possibly hearing voices that exist only in his own private universe. New fish, he announces, with the enthusiasm of someone who's just discovered a fresh source of entertainment. The bed next to yours is occupied by a woman who spends her days methodically tearing her bedsheet into increasingly smaller strips, muttering calculations under her breath, like she's solving equations that would make Newton weep. She glances up at you briefly, nods once, then returns to her textile mathematics project with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb. Your first night in the dormitory is an education in sounds you didn't know the human body could produce. Bertram talks to his ceiling friends in a voice that starts as a whisper and gradually builds to something resembling a theatrical monologue. The woman with the bed sheets, you learn her name is Millicent, counts her fabric strips obsessively, starting over whenever she loses track, which happens approximately every 17 pieces. Across the narrow aisle, a man named Cornelius has constructed what he calls his fortress of solitude using stolen pieces of furniture, strips of cloth, and what appears to be several months' worth of accumulated refuse. He peers at you through gaps in his makeshift walls like a suspicious hermit crab, occasionally making notes in a journal written in what might be code, or possibly just the scribblings of someone whose grip on reality left town years ago. Victorian asylums operated on the principle that throwing all the mentally ill people together would somehow create a therapeutic environment. It was roughly equivalent to treating a broken leg by throwing the patient into a pit with other people who had broken legs and hoping they'd all heal each other through shared suffering. The logic was impeccable if you ignored basic human psychology, medical science, and common sense. Cornelius emerges from his fortress periodically to patrol the dormitory, checking for what he calls intrusions and violations of the perimeter. His patrols consist of walking the length of the room while muttering about them and the watchers, occasionally stopping to stare at you with the intensity of someone who's just realized you might be part of whatever conspiracy he's spent years cataloging. The symphony of madness reaches its crescendo around midnight when the combination of exhaustion, medication, and accumulated stress creates a perfect storm of human misery. Someone 3 beds down begins singing what sounds like a funeral dirge in a language that might be Latin, or possibly just sounds that rhyme with despair. Another patient starts weeping with the steady rhythm of a metronome, creating a soundtrack of sorrow that would make professional mourners question their career choices. But the real challenge isn't the noise, it's the unpredictability. Mental illness in the Victorian era was treated like a character flaw rather than a medical condition, which meant patients received no real treatment for their underlying conditions. Instead, they were simply warehoused with other people who were equally unwell, creating a pressure cooker of untreated trauma and unmanaged symptoms. Bertram decides that 3 in the morning is the perfect time to reorganize his possessions, which consist mainly of things he's stolen from other patients over the years. He moves his collection of buttons, fabric scraps, and mysterious metal objects with the careful precision of someone curating a museum exhibit. The clanking and rustling would wake the dead, if the dead weren't already awake, listening to Millicent count fabric strips. The woman in the bed next to Millicent, you never learn her name, has developed the habit of sleepwalking at precisely 3:47 a.m. every night. She rises from her bed like a Victorian ghost, walks to the window, and stands there staring out at the courtyard for exactly 11 minutes before returning to bed. The first time it happens, you think she's trying to escape. The 15th time, you realize it's just another feature of your new domestic arrangements. Cornelius has apparently decided that you represent some kind of threat to his carefully constructed worldview. He begins leaving small objects near your bed, a button here, a piece of string there, as either warnings or gifts. The intent is unclear, but the message seems to be that you're now part of whatever complex mythology he's developed during his stay at the asylum. The truly disturbing part is how quickly you adapt to this chaos. Within a week, you're sleeping through sounds that would have kept you awake for days in your previous life. You learn to ignore Bertram's conversations with invisible friends, to step around Millicent's fabric projects, and to avoid making eye contact with Cornelius during his security patrols. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, even when what you're adapting to is a constant state of low-level terror. Meal times in the dormitory become exercises in tactical eating. You learn to eat quickly before someone decides your food looks more appealing than their own. You develop strategies for protecting your portion while appearing non-threatening to patients who might see food hoarding as a declaration of war. Victorian asylum dining was essentially a Lord of the Flies scenario played out with porridge and stale bread. The lack of privacy extends beyond just sharing sleeping space. There's no concept of personal belongings, personal space, or personal boundaries. Your fellow patients rummage through your possessions with the casual entitlement of people who've forgotten that other people's property exists. They wear your clothes, eat your food, and use your bed when you're not there, creating a communist society where everything belongs to everyone and nothing belongs to anyone. Hygiene becomes a group activity, whether you want it to be or not. Bertram has strong opinions about when and how people should wash, and he's not shy about sharing these opinions with anyone within earshot. Millicent uses soap to clean her fabric strips, apparently believing that clean fabric strips are somehow more mathematically significant than dirty ones. Cornelius hoards toiletries like their military supplies, creating a black market economy in soap and tooth powder. The dormitory's ecosystem develops its own rules and hierarchies that have nothing to do with sanity or rationality. Bertram, despite his ongoing conversations with imaginary friends, is considered the unofficial leader because he's been there longest and knows where the attendants hide the extra blankets. Millicent is respected for her mathematical precision and her ability to predict when meals will be served based on the patterns in her fabric. Cornelius is feared because no one's quite sure what he's capable of, and uncertainty breeds caution. The attendants who supervise your dormitory have clearly given up any pretense of maintaining order. They appear twice daily to count heads and distribute meals, but otherwise leave you to sort out your own social dynamics. Their philosophy seems to be that if everyone's still breathing at the end of the day, they've done their job successfully. The bar for success was remarkably low in Victorian institutional care. As days turn into weeks, you begin to realize that the dormitory isn't just where you sleep. It's where you'll spend the majority of your time for the foreseeable future. The other patients aren't temporary roommates. They're your new family, whether you want them or not. And like any family, they come with their own special brand of love, dysfunction, and the occasional attempt to bite you when you're not paying attention. Your own position in this hierarchy is still being determined. You're the new arrival, which makes you automatically suspect, but also potentially valuable as a source of information about the outside world. Your fellow patients quiz you about current events, fashion trends, and whether the Queen is still alive, treating you like a correspondent from a foreign country they dimly remember visiting years ago. The nights when everyone's medication kicks in simultaneously create brief periods of relative peace, but these moments are rare and precious. More often, you're treated to the full symphony of untreated mental illness played out in real time with surround sound and no intermission. It's like being trapped in a particularly avant-garde theatre production where the audience has become the performers and no one remembers the script. But even this chaos of human misery and unpredictable behavior is nothing compared to what awaits you in the morning. Because in the Victorian Asylum system, idle hands were the devil's workshop, and the devil apparently had some very specific ideas about what kind of work would be most beneficial for your mental health. 5. You'd be put to work. Immediately. The bell that wakes you at dawn sounds like it was designed by someone who believed sleep was a character flaw that needed immediate correction. You've barely had time to remember where you are and why your life has become a waking nightmare when Mrs. Grimsby appears with a clipboard and the kind of smile that suggests your day is about to get significantly worse. Right then, time to earn your keep, she announces with the cheerful malice of someone who's spent years perfecting the art of institutional cruelty. Can't have you lot sitting about feeling sorry for yourselves. Work builds character, and Lord knows you could use some. She says this while surveying a room full of people whose characters have already been thoroughly dismantled by their circumstances. Victorian asylums operated on the revolutionary principle that mental illness could be cured through hard labor. The logic was beautifully simple. If you kept patients too busy to be mad, they'd eventually forget they were mad and become productive members of society. It was therapeutic philosophy at its finest, assuming you ignored everything medical science had learned about human psychology in the previous several centuries. Your first assignment is laundry duty, which sounds innocuous until you discover that Victorian asylum laundry involved washing the clothes, bedding, and bodily fluids of several hundred mentally ill patients using equipment that would make a medieval washerwoman weep. The laundry room is a steamy hellscape of boiling water, caustic soap, and the accumulated stench of human misery processed through fabric. The washing tubs are massive iron cauldrons that bubble and steam like something from a witch's brewery. The water is heated by coal fires that turn the entire room into a sauna designed by someone with a personal vendetta against human comfort. The soap is made from lye that burns your hands and makes your eyes water, creating a work environment that combines the worst aspects of industrial labor with medieval torture techniques. Mrs. Grimsby hands you a paddle, roughly the size of a cricket bat, and points toward a tub filled with what used to be white sheets, but now resembles a stew of bodily functions and fabric. Stir that lot until it's clean, she commands, as if the concept of clean has any meaning when applied to linens that have absorbed the collective output of an entire asylum wing. The other patients, assigned to laundry duty, work with the mechanical precision of people who've learned that efficiency is the only path to survival. They don't speak, they don't make eye contact, and they definitely don't complain about the working conditions. You quickly learn why when Bertram, who apparently rotates between different work assignments, leans over and whispers, "Complain about the work," and they'll find you work to really complain about. The rhythm of asylum labor is hypnotic in its relentless monotony. Stir the laundry, lift the dripping mess, wring it out until your hands cramp. Hang it on lines that stretch across the room like a map of human suffering drawn in damp fabric. Repeat this process for 12 hours, with breaks only for meals that barely qualify as food and bathroom visits that are timed with military precision. The heat and humidity create a greenhouse effect that turns the laundry room into a tropical climate where the rain is human sweat and the vegetation is mold growing on permanently damp surfaces. Your clothes become soaked within minutes, clinging to your body like a second skin made of institutional cotton and despair. The combination of heat, humidity, and physical labor creates a state of exhaustion that makes thinking clearly nearly impossible. But laundry duty is just the appetizer in the Victorian Asylum's menu of therapeutic employment. After a week of washing other people's biological disasters, you're promoted to kitchen duty, which involves preparing meals for several hundred patients using ingredients that wouldn't pass inspection in a prison cafeteria. The kitchen is a maze of coal-fired stoves, enormous pots, and food preparation surfaces that have absorbed decades of grease, blood, and substances that defy identification. Your job is to peel vegetables that have seen better centuries, chop meat that might once have been recognizable animals, and stir pots of stew that bubble with the enthusiasm of something that's achieved sentience and is plotting its escape. The head cook, a woman named Mrs. Pudding, who apparently earned her position through sheer bloody-mindedness, rules the kitchen with an iron ladle and a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush. She explains your duties with the patient tone of someone who's explained this same information to hundreds of previous patients, most of whom didn't survive long enough to master the complexities of asylum cuisine. Peel them potatoes until they're white as your hopes of getting out of here, she instructs, handing you a knife that's been sharpened so many times it's more suggestion than blade. And mind you, don't cut yourself, we've enough blood in the stew already. She chuckles at this joke, apparently finding the concept of blood in the food absolutely hilarious. The potatoes you're assigned to peel are archaeological specimens that have achieved a state of preservation that suggests they might have been stored since the asylum opened. Some sprout growth that could charitably be called eyes, though they look more like tumors. Others have developed a patina of mold that creates artistic patterns across their surface, turning food preparation into an inadvertent art appreciation class. The meat arrives in quantities that suggest someone has emptied an entire slaughterhouse into the asylum's larder without much concern for quality control. Your job is to separate the edible portions from the portions that have achieved independent existence as biological experiments. The smell alone is enough to convince you that vegetarianism might be worth considering, assuming you survive long enough to have dietary preferences. Working in the kitchen provides a unique perspective on asylum management philosophy. Every meal is a masterpiece of cost-cutting and corner-cutting, designed to provide maximum calories with minimum expense. The results are culinary creations that challenge the very definition of food, served to patients who are too hungry to complain and too powerless to demand better. The bread you help bake is made from flour that's been extended with sawdust, creating loaves that could double as building materials. The soup is essentially hot water flavored, with whatever vegetables were too rotten to throw away, seasoned with salt and hope. The meat is cooked until it achieves the texture of leather and roughly the same nutritional value. But kitchen duty also reveals the asylum's unofficial economy of favors, bribes, and petty corruption. Patients who work in the kitchen have access to extra food, which becomes a currency more valuable than money in a place where hunger is a constant companion. A piece of slightly less moldy bread can buy you protection from more aggressive patients. A bowl of soup with actual vegetables in it can secure a better sleeping spot in the dormitory. Mrs. Pudding operates her own private system of rewards and punishments based on her personal assessment of which patients are worth helping and which deserve to suffer. Work efficiently, and you might get an extra piece of bread. Slack off, and you'll find yourself assigned to pot scrubbing duty, which involves removing burned food from pots using implements that are barely adequate for the task. The pots you're assigned to clean have developed their own ecosystem of burned food, grease, and bacterial growth that has achieved a complexity rivaling the Amazon rainforest. Some of the burned-on food has carbonized to the point where it's become one with the metal, creating permanent geographical features in the cookware. Your job is to remove these culinary archaeological layers using nothing but elbow grease and determination. After several weeks of kitchen duty, you're transferred to what Mrs. Grimsby euphemistically calls grounds maintenance, which involves keeping the asylum's outdoor spaces in a condition that won't completely horrify visiting inspectors. This means raking leaves, trimming hedges, and disposing of the various biological hazards that accumulate in any institution, housing several hundred people with limited access to proper sanitation. The asylum grounds are a testament to Victorian landscaping philosophy, which apparently involved creating outdoor spaces that looked pleasant from a distance but revealed their true nature only upon close inspection. The gardens are populated with plants that thrive in soil enriched by decades of human waste and neglect. The walkways are decorated with substances that you hope are mud, but suspect might be something more organic. Your gardening tools are implements that have seen better decades, maintained with the same attention to quality that characterizes everything else in the asylum. The rakes have teeth missing, the shovels have handles that split without warning, and the wheelbarrows have developed their own independent suspension systems that make transportation of materials an adventure in physics. But outdoor work provides something that indoor assignments don't: brief moments of fresh air and natural light that remind you that the world beyond the asylum walls still exists. These moments are precious beyond measure, offering temporary relief from the constant assault of sights, sounds, and smells that define institutional life. The work assignments rotate with the randomness of a lottery, designed by someone with a twisted sense of humor. One week you're scrubbing floors with brushes that have all the effectiveness of soggy biscuits. The next week you're assigned to coal duty, which involves hauling buckets of coal from the storage areas to the various stoves and furnaces that keep the asylum marginally habitable. Coal duty is particularly educational because it reveals the asylum's heating priorities. The administrative offices are kept toasty warm, while patient areas receive just enough heat to prevent the water pipes from freezing. The staff quarters are comfortable, while the dormitories maintain temperatures that would challenge an Arctic explorer's definition of survivable conditions. But regardless of which assignment you're given, the message is clear. Your value to the institution is measured entirely by your ability to perform manual labor. Your mental health, physical comfort, and human dignity are secondary considerations at best. The work isn't designed to cure you, it's designed to make you useful while you're being stored like excess inventory in the asylum's human warehouse. And just when you think you've mastered the rhythm of institutional labor, just when you've adapted to the relentless cycle of work and exhaustion, it's time for your next educational experience in Victorian Asylum life, discovering what passes for nutrition in a place where food is considered a privilege rather than a basic human need. 6. You'd get a meal you'd remember forever for the wrong reasons. The dinner bell rings with all the enthusiasm of a funeral dirge, which is fitting because what you're about to consume could charitably be described as the death of culinary hope. You've spent the day working in conditions that would make a Victorian factory owner blush, and now it's time to discover that the asylum's approach to nutrition is about as scientific as their approach to mental health treatment. The dining hall is a cavernous room filled with long wooden tables that look like they were carved from trees that died of despair. The benches are populated by patients who've learned that mealtime is less about eating and more about survival, where the weak starve and the strong get seconds of whatever biological experiment is being served today. Mrs. Pudding presides over the meal service with the authoritative air of someone who's spent years perfecting the art of making food inedible. She ladles portions with mathematical precision, ensuring that everyone gets exactly the same amount of whatever's lurking in the enormous pots, regardless of size, appetite, or will to live. Equal portions for equal madness, she announces cheerfully, as if this motto were embroidered on the asylum's coat of arms. Your bowl contains what the kitchen staff optimistically calls soup, though that term requires a fairly liberal interpretation of both soup and food. The liquid is a murky brown color that suggests it began life as water and achieved its current state through a process involving vegetables that surrendered their will to live sometime during the reign of George III. Floating in this broth are objects that might once have been potatoes or possibly chunks of wood that fell into the pot during preparation. The bread that accompanies your soup has the density of a building material and roughly the same nutritional value. It's been baked to a consistency that challenges the very definition of bread, creating a substance that requires both determination and strong teeth to consume. The crust could be used as a weapon in emergencies, while the interior has the texture of compressed sawdust seasoned with optimism. Victorian asylum nutrition was based on the revolutionary principle that mental patients required fewer calories than normal people, operating on the theory that madness somehow reduced the body's need for sustenance. The result was a dietary regimen that would make prison food look like haute cuisine. Patients received just enough nutrition to prevent immediate death, but not enough to maintain either physical health or mental clarity. The meat portion of your meal arrives in the form of something that might once have been recognizable as animal protein before it underwent the asylum's unique cooking process. It has the color of old leather and roughly the same texture, having been boiled into submission until it achieved a state of complete surrender. The flavor is best described as absence of flavor, with subtle notes of despair and a finish that lingers in your mouth like a bad decision. Your dining companions approach their meals with the resigned efficiency of people who've learned that eating is a necessary evil rather than a pleasure. Bertram methodically sorts his soup ingredients by color before consuming them in a specific order that only makes sense to him. Millicent counts her breadcrumbs before eating them, apparently believing that mathematical precision will somehow improve the taste. The woman sitting across from you, Martha, who's been here longer than anyone cares to remember, offers practical advice while dissecting her meat with surgical precision. Chew it fast and swallow faster, she suggests, and try not to think about what it used to be before it ended up in here. Her wisdom comes from years of experience with asylum cuisine, and her survival proves that the human digestive system is remarkably adaptable to circumstances that would challenge a goat's constitution. The vegetables on your plate have been cooked into submission, achieving a state of molecular breakdown that transforms them into something resembling baby food for adults with poor judgment. The carrots have become orange mush, the cabbage has dissolved into green sludge, and the turnips have achieved a philosophical state where they're neither solid nor liquid, but exist in some quantum superposition of disappointing sustenance. But the truly remarkable aspect of asylum dining isn't just the quality of the food, it's the complete absence of seasoning, flavor, or anything that might make eating an enjoyable experience. Salt is rationed like a precious metal, pepper is a rumor, and herbs are apparently considered too stimulating for the delicate constitutions of mental patients. The result is cuisine that tastes like it was designed by someone who'd heard food described but never actually eaten any. The dining hall's atmosphere contributes to the overall charm of mealtime, with sounds that range from the scraping of spoons against bowls to the occasional sob of someone who's just realized they have to eat this food or starve. The acoustics amplify every slurp, every reluctant swallow, and every whispered prayer for divine intervention in the form of actual nutrition. Mrs. Pudding patrols the dining hall like a general inspecting troops, ensuring that everyone finishes their portions regardless of palatability or basic food safety concerns. "Waste not, want not," she declares, apparently unaware that wanting is a natural response to being served food that challenges the very concept of edibility. Patients who don't finish their meals face consequences that make the food itself seem appetizing by comparison. The eating utensils provided are implements that have seen better decades, with spoons that bend under the weight of the soup and knives that couldn't cut through butter if butter were on the menu, which it isn't. The forks have tines missing, creating unique eating experiences where getting food from plate to mouth becomes an engineering challenge requiring both skill and determination. Halfway through your meal, you notice that your soup has developed a thin film on its surface that creates rainbow patterns when the light hits it just right. This natural phenomenon might be beautiful if it weren't floating on top of something you're expected to consume. The film has the consistency of motor oil and roughly the same appeal as a beverage choice. The bread continues to challenge your dental work with each bite, requiring jaw muscles that would make a professional boxer envious. Some patients have developed techniques for softening their bread by soaking it in the soup, creating a combination that achieves new heights of culinary disappointment. Others simply give up and gnaw on it, like determined beavers working on a particularly stubborn log. The asylum's water supply deserves special mention for its unique flavor profile, which combines the refreshing taste of rust with subtle notes of whatever's growing in the pipes. The water has a distinctive brown tinge that the staff insists is mineral content, though the minerals in question seem to include iron filings and possibly small amounts of what you hope is just sediment. Tea time offers no relief from the culinary assault, featuring a beverage that bears the same relationship to actual tea that the soup bears to actual food. The leaves have been steeped to the point where they've given up all hope of producing flavor, creating a liquid that's essentially hot water with delusions of being tea. The milk provided has achieved a state of preservation that suggests it might be older than some of the patients. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of asylum dining is how quickly you adapt to these conditions. After a week of eating food that would make a workhouse meal look appetizing, your standards adjust to the point where finding a piece of meat that doesn't require archaeological excavation becomes a cause for celebration. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, even when what you're adapting to is the systematic destruction of every pleasant association you've ever had with food. The dinner conversation, such as it is, revolves around comparing the relative merits of different days' meals and speculating about the origins of various mystery ingredients. Tuesday's stew had something that might have been turnip, observes one patient with the tone of someone discussing a rare archaeological find. Thursday's bread was definitely harder than usual, adds another as if this were a meaningful distinction. The cleanup process after meals involves washing dishes in water that's been used to wash dozens of previous sets of dishes, creating a recycling system that would make environmental enthusiasts weep. The soap is rationed to the point where its presence is more theoretical than actual, and the drying cloths have achieved a state of permanent dampness that suggests they've given up on the concept of drying entirely. By the time you finish your meal, you understand why asylum patients often develop that particular hollow-eyed look that suggests they're seeing things that aren't there. It's not madness, it's malnutrition combined with the psychological trauma of realizing that this culinary nightmare will be repeated 3 times daily for the foreseeable future. The final insult comes when Mrs. Pudding announces that tomorrow's menu will feature special Sunday roast, as if the concept of improvement were possible within the constraints of asylum cuisine. The other patients exchange glances that suggest they've heard this promise before and know better than to get their hopes up. As you're marched back to the dormitory, still tasting the lingering effects of your educational meal, you realize that you've crossed another threshold in your asylum experience. You've now eaten food that exists primarily as a biological necessity rather than anything resembling nutrition or pleasure. Your body is learning to survive on substances that challenge the very definition of edible, and your mind is adapting to the reality that this is your new normal. But even this assault on your digestive system and culinary expectations is just preparation for the next phase of your asylum education. Because in the Victorian institutional system, your identity as a person is about to be replaced by something much simpler, much more permanent, and absolutely impossible to escape, no matter how hard you try to prove them wrong. 3 weeks into your stay at Bethlehem, you make a fatal mistake. You try to maintain some semblance of dignity during a particularly degrading bath session. You don't scream, you don't struggle, you simply endure with what you foolishly believe is admirable composure. Mrs. Grimsby observes this display of restraint and makes a note in her ledger that will haunt you for the rest of your asylum career. Patient displays suspicious stoicism. Recommend classification as the silent one. Satiety. You'd be given a label you can't escape. Congratulations. You now have a new identity that's about as permanent as a tattoo and roughly as flattering as a scarlet letter. In the Victorian Asylum system, labels weren't just administrative convenience, they were destiny written in ink that would never fade, no matter how much your actual behavior might change. The nickname travels through the asylum's gossip network with the speed of cholera through a Victorian slum. By afternoon, attendants are calling you silent with the casual familiarity of people who've forgotten you ever had an actual name. By evening, even the other patients have adopted it, and your original identity begins to fade like a photograph left in sunlight. But here's the truly diabolical part. The labels became self-fulfilling prophecies with the inexorable force of gravity. Once you're the silent one, every natural conversation you have is interpreted as evidence of manipulative behavior. When you laugh at Bertram's jokes, the attendants note your inappropriate effect. When you cry during particularly difficult moments, they record your sudden emotional outbursts. The label doesn't describe your behavior, it distorts everyone's perception of your behavior. Labels in Victorian asylums served multiple purposes, none of them particularly helpful for the people wearing them. They allowed staff to quickly categorize patients without the inconvenience of actually observing their behavior or understanding their individual circumstances. They created a shorthand system for managing hundreds of people whose complex human personalities had been reduced to single defining characteristics. Mrs. Grimsby explains the asylum's labeling system with the pride of someone who's invented a particularly clever filing system. Makes everything so much more efficient, she says, as if human beings were books in a library that needed proper cataloguing. The screamer in Ward 3, the wanderer in Ward 7, the stubborn one in Ward 12. Everyone knows exactly what they're dealing with. The other patients sport their own collection of asylum nicknames, worn like badges of institutional membership. Martha is the mother because she offers advice to newer patients, though this label means her every attempt at kindness is viewed as manipulative behavior designed to gain influence over vulnerable people. Cornelius is the watcher because of his paranoid observation of the staff. which means his legitimate concerns about mistreatment are dismissed as delusional ramblings. Bertram has achieved the distinction of multiple labels depending on which shift is working. The day staff calls him the talker because of his conversations with invisible friends. The night staff calls him the howler because he sometimes has nightmares that wake half the dormitory. The medical staff calls him chronic case #47 because they've given up any pretense of treating him as an individual human being. Dr. Pemberton uses your label as a diagnostic tool, interpreting everything about you through the lens of your assigned identity. The silent one exhibits classic signs of suppressed mania, he tells his medical students during their weekly rounds. Note how the silence itself becomes a form of aggression, a refusal to engage with therapeutic intervention. Your perfectly normal response to traumatic circumstances has become evidence of a deeper psychological pathology. Your attempts to escape your label only reinforce it in the minds of the staff. Try to engage in normal conversation, and you're displaying manipulative social behavior inconsistent with previous silent patterns. Remain quiet, and you're continuing established pattern of withdrawn, suspicious silence. It's a psychological prison with walls made of other people's expectations, and every attempt to break free just builds the walls higher. The labeling system reveals the Victorian Asylum's fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. They believed that mental illness created fixed, unchanging personality types that could be identified and managed like species in a zoo. The possibility that people might have good days and bad days, or that behavior might change in response to treatment or circumstances, simply didn't exist in their theoretical framework. The worst part isn't being labeled. It's watching how the label changes the way everyone treats you. Attendants who might have shown basic human decency now view every interaction through the lens of your assigned identity. Your requests for basic necessities are interpreted as manipulative attempts to break established silent patterns. Your expressions of pain or distress are dismissed as theatrical displays inconsistent with patients' typical presentation. The medical students scribble notes about your pathological silence and resistant personality structure, creating documentation that will follow you through the asylum system like a criminal record. Future doctors will read these assessments and approach you with preconceived notions about your character, your prognosis, and your worthiness for treatment. Your label has become more real than your actual personality. Other patients begin to adjust their behavior around you based on your institutional reputation. Some avoid you because the silent one sounds ominous and potentially dangerous. Others try to provoke reactions from you, treating your supposed silence like, "8, you'd get a treatment." You can't pronounce, let alone consent. Dr. Pemberton appears at your bedside one morning with the satisfied expression of someone who's just discovered a particularly interesting insect specimen. He's flanked by his usual entourage of medical students, all clutching notebooks and wearing the eager expressions of people about to witness something educational and probably horrifying. The silent one presents an excellent opportunity for therapeutic intervention, he announces, as if you're not lying right there listening to every word. We shall employ a combination of phrenological adjustment and galvanic stimulation therapy. The medical students scribble frantically, apparently impressed by terminology that sounds scientific enough to mask the fact that no one has any idea what they're actually doing. Victorian medical science had an impressive talent for creating treatments that sounded legitimately therapeutic while being essentially elaborate forms of torture dressed up in academic language. Phrenological adjustment involved manipulating the skull based on the revolutionary theory that personality traits were controlled by bumps on your head. Galvanic stimulation meant applying electrical current to various parts of your body to see what happened, operating on the scientific principle that if something was unpleasant enough, it must be medically beneficial. The treatment room resembles a combination of medieval dungeon and mad scientist's laboratory, complete with brass instruments that look like they were designed by someone who'd heard medical equipment described but never actually seen any. The centerpiece is a chair that wouldn't look out of place in an execution chamber, complete with leather restraints and metal fixtures, whose purpose you'd rather not contemplate. "Please take a seat," Dr. Pemberton instructs with the polite tone of someone offering you tea, completely ignoring the fact that the chair is clearly designed to prevent any possibility of voluntary departure. The attendants secure your arms and legs with straps that have been worn smooth by hundreds of previous patients who've experienced the asylum's cutting-edge therapeutic interventions. The phrenological examination begins with Dr. Pemberton running his fingers across your skull like a pianist practicing scales. He makes thoughtful humming sounds as he identifies various bumps and depressions, occasionally calling his students' attention to particularly interesting cranial features. "Note the pronounced development of the secretiveness area," he observes, as if your supposed tendency towards silence were literally written in the shape of your head. The skull measurements are recorded with scientific precision, using calipers that pinch your skin and make precise documentation possible. Your head circumference, the distance between your ears, and the angle of your forehead are all carefully noted in Dr. Pemberton's leather-bound journal. The measurements will become part of your permanent medical record, creating an official documentation of your cranial abnormalities that will follow you forever. The silent one exhibits classic signs of overdeveloped cautiousness combined with deficient communication organs. Dr. Pemberton explains to his students, who nod with the serious attention of people learning important scientific facts. Therapeutic manipulation of the cranial structure should help realign these imbalanced characteristics. He says this while applying pressure to various points on your skull, apparently believing that personality adjustments can be made through vigorous head massage. The galvanic stimulation equipment arrives on a wheeled cart that looks like it was assembled from spare parts of a lightning rod factory. Copper wires, glass jars filled with mysterious liquids, and metal plates connected to what appears to be a hand-cranked generator create an impressive display of Victorian electrical engineering. The whole apparatus hums and crackles with barely contained energy that makes your teeth ache just looking at it. Electrical stimulation of the nervous system has shown remarkable therapeutic benefits. Dr. Pemberton lectures while attaching copper electrodes to various parts of your body. The galvanic current will help restore proper neural functioning and encourage more appropriate behavioral responses. The electrodes are cold against your skin and secured with leather straps that ensure you'll receive the full benefit of whatever electrical adventure they have planned. The medical students gather closer as Dr. Pemberton begins operating the hand crank that generates the electrical current. The machine whirs and sparks with the enthusiastic energy of something that was never designed with human safety as a primary concern. The first jolt of electricity makes every muscle in your body contract involuntarily, creating a sensation like being struck by lightning while sitting in a bathtub full of angry eels. "Excellent muscular response," observes Dr. Pemberton with the satisfied tone of someone whose experiment is proceeding exactly as planned. The electrical stimulation is clearly reaching the affected neural pathways. He increases the intensity of the current, apparently believing that more electricity will produce proportionally better therapeutic results. The combination of electrical shock and cranial manipulation creates a sensory experience that defies description in polite language. Your vision fills with bright flashes of light that exist only in your overstimulated nervous system. Your hearing becomes a symphony of ringing, buzzing, and sounds that might be your own screaming, but seem to be coming from somewhere very far away. Your sense of touch expands to include every nerve ending in your body, all of them reporting the same message. This is definitely not helping. The medical students take detailed notes about your responses to treatment, recording every twitch, cry, and involuntary movement as if they were documenting a fascinating natural phenomenon. Patient exhibits strong physical reaction to galvanic therapy, writes one student, apparently impressed by your body's natural response to being electrocuted. Suggest continued treatment to achieve full therapeutic benefit, adds another, because clearly what you need is more of this experience. Dr. Pemberton pauses the electrical treatment to check your pulse and examine your pupils, apparently concerned that you might be enjoying the experience too much. Physiological responses within normal parameters, he announces, as if there were established norms for how people should react to voluntary electrocution. We can safely continue with the prescribed therapeutic regimen. The cranial manipulation resumes with increased vigor, as Dr. Pemberton attempts to physically reshape your personality through aggressive skull massage. He applies pressure to points that correspond to various character traits, apparently believing that pushing hard enough on the right spots will transform you into a more cooperative patient. The pressure creates headaches that feel like your brain is trying to escape through your ears. The combination of phrenological adjustment and galvanic stimulation represents the latest advances in alienistic medicine. Dr. Pemberton explains to his students while you're experiencing what feels like having your nervous system rewired by an enthusiastic amateur electrician. These scientific approaches offer hope for patients previously considered incurable. The hope apparently involves subjecting you to experiences that would make medieval torture victims grateful for their simpler, more straightforward suffering. The electrical treatments continue in carefully measured intervals, with Dr. Pemberton adjusting the voltage and duration based on your responses. Every involuntary muscle spasm is interpreted as evidence of therapeutic progress. Every cry of pain is recorded as positive engagement with the treatment process. Your suffering has become data points in an experiment that prioritizes scientific curiosity over human welfare. The session continues for what feels like several geological ages, but is probably only an hour, though time becomes meaningless when every second is filled with sensations that shouldn't exist in a universe designed by a benevolent creator. By the time Dr. Pemberton declares the treatment complete, you've discovered muscles you didn't know you possessed and experienced types of pain that don't have names in any language. Excellent therapeutic session, Dr. Pemberton announces while removing the electrodes with the casual efficiency of someone unplugging a household appliance. The patient showed strong responsiveness to treatment and should benefit from regular repetition of this therapeutic regimen. The medical students nod approvingly, apparently convinced they've witnessed cutting-edge medical science rather than elaborate sadism disguised as treatment. Your release from the treatment chair requires assistance because your legs have temporarily forgotten how to support your weight. The attendants help you stand with the practiced care of people who've guided many previous patients through the aftermath of Victorian therapeutic intervention. Every movement sends echoes of electrical sensation through your nervous system, creating aftershocks that remind you of your recent educational experience. The walk back to your dormitory is an adventure in relearning basic motor functions while your nervous system attempts to process what just happened to it. Other patients observe your post-treatment condition with expressions ranging from sympathy to relief that it wasn't their turn for therapeutic advancement. Bertram offers helpful advice about recovering from galvanic therapy, apparently speaking from extensive personal experience. Dr. Pemberton schedules your next treatment session with the cheerful efficiency of someone booking a pleasant social engagement. Same time next week, he announces, making a note in his appointment book. Regular therapeutic intervention will be essential for achieving the full benefits of this treatment protocol. Your future now includes weekly appointments with electrical torture disguised as medical care. The truly disturbing realization is that Dr. Pemberton genuinely believes he's helping you. His enthusiasm for these treatments isn't sadistic. It's the passionate dedication of someone who thinks he's practicing cutting-edge medicine. The Victorian medical establishment had convinced itself that elaborate suffering was therapeutically beneficial, creating a system where torture could be prescribed with the best of intentions. Your post-treatment symptoms are carefully monitored and recorded as part of your ongoing medical evaluation. The headaches, muscle spasms, and temporary memory difficulties are all noted as expected therapeutic responses, rather than signs that you've been subjected to treatments that would violate modern medical ethics in approximately 17 different ways. But even this systematic assault on your nervous system is just another step in your ongoing asylum education, because in the Victorian institutional system, your treatments are just the beginning of a surveillance regime that will make privacy seem like a quaint historical concept that once existed in a simpler, more innocent time before the invention of therapeutic observation. 9. You'd be constantly watched, except when you actually need help. The eyes are everywhere, not metaphorically, literally everywhere, like some Victorian version of surveillance technology that runs on human curiosity and institutional paranoia. From the moment you wake up until the moment you fall into whatever passes for sleep in this place, someone is watching you with the intensity of a cat observing a mouse that might be planning something suspicious. Your morning routine begins with an attendant standing at the foot of your bed, clipboard in hand, recording the exact time you open your eyes. Subject awakens at 6:47 a.m. She notes with the precision of someone documenting evidence for a future trial. Displays typical morning disorientation followed by rapid awareness of surroundings. The fact that anyone would be disoriented upon waking in a Victorian asylum apparently requires detailed documentation. The watching continues as you dress, with every movement analyzed for signs of your mental state. Put your left sock on first, and they record patient exhibits consistent behavioral patterns suggesting obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Put your right sock on first, and they note patient shows unpredictable behavior patterns indicating potential instability. There's literally no way to put on socks that won't be interpreted as evidence of your psychological condition. Victorian asylums operated on the theory that constant observation would provide valuable insights into the nature of mental illness. The reality was that they'd created a system where normal human behavior was pathologized through intensive scrutiny, while actual emergencies were ignored because the staff was too busy taking notes to provide assistance. Breakfast provides another opportunity for detailed behavioral analysis. The way you hold your spoon is recorded as patient demonstrates unusual grip tension, suggesting underlying anxiety. The order in which you eat your food becomes patient shows ritualistic eating patterns consistent with obsessive personality structure. Your natural preference for eating bread before porridge is apparently diagnostic material worthy of its own paragraph in your ever-expanding medical file. The attendants have developed a complex system of note-taking that turns every aspect of your existence into potential evidence. They record how you walk, how you sit, how you breathe, and how you look at them when they're recording how you breathe. The circular nature of this surveillance creates an infinite loop of observation that would be philosophically fascinating if it weren't so psychologically devastating. During work assignments, you're watched with the intensity of someone monitoring a dangerous chemical reaction. Sweep too efficiently, and they note patient displays manic energy during menial tasks. Sweep too slowly, and they record patient shows signs of depression and motor retardation. There's apparently no acceptable speed for sweeping that won't be interpreted as evidence of your mental deficiency. The medical students conduct their own observations as part of their training, treating you like a living textbook that they can study in real time. They follow you around taking notes about your behavioral presentations and symptom manifestations, apparently unaware that being followed around by people taking notes might influence your behavior in ways that have nothing to do with mental illness. Your every word is recorded and analyzed for hidden meanings, creating a linguistic surveillance system that would make professional cryptographers impressed. Say good morning to a fellow patient, and they note patient attempts to establish social connections, possibly indicating manipulative tendencies. Remain silent, and they record patient maintains antisocial behavior patterns consistent with established diagnosis. Even your choice of topics for conversation becomes diagnostic material. The observation extends to your sleep, with attendants making regular rounds to check your breathing, position, and whether you're experiencing nightmares. They record the exact times you toss and turn, apparently believing that your sleeping patterns provide insights into your psychological state. The fact that being watched while sleeping might cause restlessness doesn't seem to occur to them. But here's where the system reveals its fundamental contradiction. While you're being observed constantly for minor behavioral details, actual emergencies are ignored with the dedication of people who've perfected the art of selective blindness. When Martha collapses from exhaustion during work detail, the attendants are busy recording someone else's suspicious sock-wearing patterns. When Bertram develops what appears to be a serious infection, the staff is occupied documenting whether patients are eating their porridge in clockwise or counterclockwise stirring motions. The watching becomes so pervasive that you start to modify your behavior to avoid giving them more material for their observations. You learn to walk with measured steps, speak in neutral tones, and maintain carefully neutral expressions that hopefully won't trigger additional documentation. The surveillance has achieved its ultimate goal. You're now performing normalcy rather than actually experiencing it. Your bathroom visits are timed and recorded, with attendants noting duration, frequency, and your general demeanor during biological necessities. Patient spent 4 minutes and 23 seconds in water closet. They record with the precision of someone timing an athletic event. Displayed appropriate privacy-seeking behavior consistent with social conditioning. The fact that you want privacy while using the toilet apparently requires psychological analysis. The dining hall becomes a theater where every meal is a performance under scrutiny. The way you hold your fork is recorded as patient demonstrates unusual tension in hand muscles suggesting underlying stress. The pace at which you eat becomes patient shows either rushed consumption indicating anxiety or slow consumption indicating depression. You can't win, which is rather the point of the whole system. Dr. Pemberton reviews these observation reports with the enthusiasm of someone reading particularly engaging literature. Excellent documentation, he tells the attendants while flipping through pages of notes about your sock-wearing patterns. These detailed observations provide valuable insights into the patient's psychological state and treatment responsiveness. The absurdity of using sock preferences as diagnostic material apparently doesn't diminish his scientific enthusiasm. The surveillance creates a feedback loop that makes actual mental health deterioration almost inevitable. The constant scrutiny creates genuine anxiety, which is then recorded as evidence of your underlying mental illness. Your natural responses to being watched constantly become symptoms that confirm the original diagnosis that put you under surveillance in the first place. Your fellow patients learn to navigate this observation system with varying degrees of success. Some perform elaborate acts of normalcy, creating carefully crafted personas designed to minimize negative documentation. Others rebel against the watching by engaging in deliberately bizarre behavior that gives the attendants plenty to write about. Most just accept it as another feature of asylum life, like bad food and cold dormitories. The observation reports become a form of institutional currency, with attendants competing to record the most interesting or unusual behaviors. Patient exhibited 17 distinct facial expressions during breakfast becomes a source of professional pride for the attendant, who managed to catalog them all. Your human complexity has been reduced to a counting exercise that treats emotions like inventory items. But the most disturbing aspect of the surveillance system is how it creates the illusion of care while providing none of the substance. The attendants know exactly how many times you've used the bathroom, but they don't know that you've been experiencing severe headaches for weeks. They can tell you the precise time you fell asleep last night, but they haven't noticed that you've been having difficulty swallowing food. The watching is so comprehensive that it becomes invisible, like wallpaper that you stop noticing after living with it long enough. You adapt to the constant scrutiny until it feels normal to have someone recording your every movement. The surveillance has achieved its ultimate victory. You've stopped expecting privacy because you've forgotten what privacy feels like. Medical students learn to conduct observations as part of their training. treating patients like specimens in a laboratory rather than human beings with thoughts and feelings. They discuss your behaviors in front of you as if you're not present, analyzing your responses to their analysis in an endless cycle of academic observation that serves no therapeutic purpose. The irony reaches its peak during moments of actual crisis, when the elaborate observation system fails completely. When patients have genuine medical emergencies, the attendants are often too busy documenting routine behaviors to notice that someone is actually dying. The system that claims to provide comprehensive care through constant watching turns out to be remarkably blind to actual human suffering. Your realization that you're being watched constantly but never actually helped creates a particular type of psychological pressure that would make professional interrogators take notes. You're simultaneously the most observed person in the building and the most neglected, creating a form of isolation that's more complete than simple solitude. The observation records become part of your permanent file, creating a detailed documentary of your asylum experience that will follow you forever. Future doctors will read these reports and make treatment decisions based on notes about your sock preferences and breakfast eating patterns, as if these observations were meaningful diagnostic information rather than the pointless, busy work of a surveillance system that had lost sight of its supposed purpose. But even this systematic observation and documentation is just preparation for the next phase of your asylum education, because the Victorian institutional system has some very specific ideas about what kinds of diseases flourish in environments where hundreds of people are warehoused together with minimal attention to sanitation, nutrition, or basic human hygiene. 10. You'd catch something, and we're not talking feelings. The itching starts on a Tuesday morning, beginning as a minor annoyance that you attribute to the asylum's industrial-strength soap and the emotional stress of living in what amounts to a human storage facility. By Thursday, you're scratching with the desperate intensity of someone who's discovered that their skin has become a popular tourist destination for several varieties of Victorian parasites. Welcome to the asylum's unofficial welcoming committee, a thriving ecosystem of lice, scabies, bedbugs, and various other creatures that treat human flesh like an all-you-can-eat buffet. The Victorian era's understanding of hygiene was roughly equivalent to their understanding of mental health treatment, which is to say, it existed primarily as a theoretical concept that had little impact on actual practice. The dormitory's bedding hasn't been properly cleaned since the asylum opened, creating a textile archaeology project where layers of human residue have accumulated into something resembling geological strata. Your mattress is home to generations of parasites that have established complex family trees and probably hold their own social gatherings when the lights go out. The blankets you share with other patients have achieved a state of biological diversity that would fascinate naturalists if they were brave enough to study them. Mrs. Grimsby's response to your complaints about itching demonstrates the asylum's sophisticated approach to pest control. "Bit of itching never hurt anyone," she announces while making a note in your file about patient displays hypochondriacal concerns regarding normal institutional conditions. The fact that your arms are covered in red welts apparently falls under the category of normal institutional conditions that don't require intervention. The scabies mites have established a thriving colony in the space between your fingers, creating tunnels under your skin that itch with the persistence of someone knocking on a door that will never be answered. The itching becomes so intense that sleep becomes impossible, leaving you to join the nocturnal chorus of scratching that provides the soundtrack for asylum nights. The sound of dozens of people simultaneously scratching creates a rhythm that would be hypnotic if it weren't so thoroughly disturbing. Victorian medical science had some fascinating theories about parasitic infestations, most of which involved blaming the victims for moral failings that somehow attracted insects. Pemberton explains that your lice infestation is likely connected to the patient's underlying nervous condition, which creates skin secretions that attract parasitic organisms. The fact that everyone in the asylum has similar problems apparently doesn't challenge this brilliant diagnostic insight. The bathing facilities, when they're available, use water that's been recycled through dozens of previous patients, creating a communal soup of human bacteria and parasitic organisms. The soap is rationed to the point where its presence is more ceremonial than functional, and the towels have achieved a state of perpetual dampness that makes them ideal breeding grounds for organisms that prefer moist environments. Your attempts to maintain basic cleanliness are hampered by the asylum's creative approach to laundry services. Clothes are washed in batches that mix garments from patients with various infectious conditions, ensuring that everyone shares whatever biological adventures anyone might be experiencing. The washing process uses water that's barely warm enough to dissolve dirt, let alone kill parasites, creating a laundering system that redistributes organisms rather than eliminating them. The medical students who observe your condition treat your parasitic infestations like fascinating case studies rather than health problems requiring treatment. Note the patient's response to ectoparasitic invasion. One records while you're scratching yourself raw during their morning rounds. Observe how the scratching behavior intensifies under observation, suggesting psychological components to the physiological condition. But parasites are just the opening act in the asylum's festival of infectious diseases. The close quarters, poor nutrition, and inadequate sanitation create perfect conditions for tuberculosis, which spreads through the dormitories with the efficiency of gossip in a small town. The persistent coughing that echoes through the halls isn't just the sound of people clearing their throats. It's the soundtrack of a disease that thrives in environments where human beings are packed together like cargo. The asylum's response to tuberculosis outbreaks demonstrates their sophisticated understanding of infectious disease management. Patients who develop persistent coughs are moved to isolation wards, which are essentially the same overcrowded dormitories with slightly less ventilation. The theory seems to be that tuberculosis will be discouraged by poor air circulation and reduced comfort, a medical strategy that would make medieval plague doctors question their career choices. Your roommate Bertram develops what appears to be a serious chest infection, but his reports of difficulty breathing are interpreted as anxiety manifestations related to his underlying psychiatric condition. The attendants make notes about his psychosomatic respiratory symptoms while he's literally coughing up blood into rags that haven't been properly cleaned or disposed of. The blood-stained fabric gets mixed in with the general laundry, creating a disease distribution system that would impress biological warfare specialists. The kitchen's approach to food safety contributes generously to the asylum's infectious disease environment. Meat is stored without refrigeration until it develops its own ecosystems. Vegetables are prepared by people whose understanding of hand washing is purely theoretical, and cooking utensils are cleaned with water that's already contaminated with whatever organisms are currently popular in the asylum community. Your digestive system begins experiencing the special joys of institutional dining, starting with stomach cramping that feels like someone's rearranging your internal organs with a rusty spoon. The diarrhea that follows creates its own challenges in an environment where toilet facilities are shared by dozens of people and cleaned with the same attention to detail that characterizes everything else in the asylum. The shared toilet facilities become ground zero for diseases that spread through contact with contaminated surfaces. The toilet seats, when they exist, haven't been properly disinfected since the Victorian era began, creating biological hazards that would challenge modern hazmat teams. Hand washing facilities consist of communal basins filled with water that's been used by everyone who came before you, turning basic hygiene into a game of bacterial roulette. Dr. Pemberton's medical rounds include brief examinations of patients who are clearly suffering from infectious diseases, but his focus remains on psychological rather than physical symptoms. Patient exhibits somatic complaints consistent with conversion disorder. He notes while examining someone whose skin condition would make lepers feel sympathy. Recommend continued psychiatric intervention rather than unnecessary medical treatment. the asylum's pharmacy stocks remedies that are roughly as effective as wishful thinking, including patent medicines that contain more alcohol than active ingredients, and topical treatments that seem designed to make skin conditions worse rather than better. The medical supplies are rationed like wartime resources, with basic medications reserved for patients whose conditions are deemed genuinely medical rather than psychological manifestations. Your attempts to treat your own conditions using folk remedies learned from other patients create an underground economy of medical advice that ranges from useful to potentially lethal. Martha recommends soaking infected areas in salt water, which actually helps. Cornelius suggests rubbing coal dust on rashes, which definitely doesn't help and creates additional problems that require their own folk remedies. The truly disturbing aspect of the asylum's disease environment isn't just the infections themselves, it's how quickly you adapt to living with conditions that would have horrified you in your previous life. Constant itching becomes background noise that you learn to ignore. Persistent coughing becomes so common that silence seems unusual. Your standards for what constitutes acceptable health deteriorate along with your actual physical condition. The medical records that document your various infections and infestations become part of your permanent file, but they're interpreted primarily as evidence of your psychological state rather than the natural result of living in unsanitary conditions. Patient demonstrates multiple somatic complaints, suggesting hypochondriacal tendencies, reads one report, apparently written by someone who's never experienced scabies personally. The seasonal changes bring new varieties of diseases and parasites, creating a year-round festival of infectious organisms that treat the asylum like an exclusive resort, designed specifically for their comfort and reproduction. Summer brings flies and other insects that spread disease with the efficiency of a postal service run by creatures with wings. Winter brings respiratory infections that spread through the inadequately heated dormitories like wildfire through dry timber. Your immune system, already compromised by poor nutrition, constant stress, and inadequate sleep, begins to surrender to the constant assault of organisms that see you as an opportunity rather than a person. The infections become chronic conditions that define your daily experience, creating new forms of suffering that complement the psychological torments you're already enduring. But even this systematic destruction of your physical health through institutional neglect is just another layer in the asylum's comprehensive assault on human dignity, because the Victorian system has one more educational experience waiting for you, a demonstration of how false hope can be more psychologically devastating than honest despair, and how moments of apparent peace can be transformed into weapons of institutional control. 11. You'd be lulled into thinking you're safe. Then hear the screaming start again. For exactly 17 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, the asylum falls silent, not the usual silence punctuated by distant sobbing or the rhythmic banging from the isolation cells, but actual, genuine quiet that makes you believe for one foolish moment that you might have found peace in this God-forsaken place. The sunlight streaming through the barred windows creates geometric patterns on the floor that look almost beautiful, and you allow yourself the dangerous luxury of thinking that maybe, just maybe, things might be getting better. This is your first mistake in what will become a masterclass in institutional psychological warfare. The silence is so unusual that you notice other patients beginning to relax in ways you haven't seen since your arrival. Bertram stops his eternal conversation with the ceiling and actually looks around the room with something approaching contentment. Millicent sets down her fabric strips and allows herself a small smile. Even Cornelius emerges from his fortress of paranoia to enjoy the unexpected tranquility. For those precious 17 minutes, the asylum feels almost human. Victorian asylums had accidentally discovered that brief periods of peace were more psychologically devastating than constant chaos, though they probably would have stumbled onto this insight by pure chance rather than design. The human mind, when subjected to relentless stress, develops coping mechanisms that allow survival in impossible conditions. But hope, That's the killer. Hope makes everything that comes after exponentially worse. You're sitting in the day room, actually reading a book that someone left behind, a miracle in itself when the first scream cuts through the silence like a rusty blade through silk. It's coming from the women's ward, a sound that starts as a human voice and transforms into something that suggests the person making it has moved beyond the realm of ordinary suffering into territory that doesn't have maps. The scream continues for what feels like geological ages, rising and falling in waves that make the hair on your arms stand up in primitive recognition that something is very, very wrong. Other patients begin showing signs of distress, rocking, muttering, returning to their defensive behaviors with the speed of people who know from experience that peace in this place is always temporary. Mrs. Grimsby appears in the doorway with the expression of someone who's dealing with a minor plumbing problem rather than what sounds like someone being murdered in a particularly creative fashion. Right then, nothing to worry about, she announces to the room, as if her words could somehow undo what everyone's ears are processing. Just a bit of therapeutic intervention in Ward C. Carry on with your activities. The screaming stops as abruptly as it began, leaving a silence that's somehow more disturbing than the noise was. You realize that you've been holding your breath along with everyone else in the room, creating a tableau of frozen anxiety that would make a Renaissance painter weep. The peace that felt so precious just moments ago now seems like a cruel joke, a setup for whatever fresh hell just announced itself from down the corridor. But the silence doesn't last. Within minutes, a different voice takes up where the first one left off. This time from the men's isolation ward, this screamer has a different vocal quality. Deeper, more sustained, with occasional breaks that suggest the person is pausing to gather strength for the next assault on everyone's sanity. The sound echoes through the corridors like a demonic opera performed by someone who's forgotten all the words, except the ones that express pure agony. Your book, the one you were foolishly enjoying just minutes ago, becomes impossible to focus on. The words blur together as your brain tries to process the cognitive dissonance between the normal activity of reading and the decidedly abnormal soundtrack of human suffering. The other patients abandon any pretense of normal activity and return to their various coping mechanisms with the efficiency of soldiers taking defensive positions. Bertram resumes his ceiling conversations, but now his voice has an urgent quality that suggests he's seeking reassurance from his invisible friends about whatever's happening in the asylum's less visible corners. Millicent picks up her fabric strips and begins counting them with frantic intensity, apparently believing that mathematical precision will somehow create order in a world that's clearly lost its collective mind. The screaming continues in shifts, as if the asylum has developed its own schedule of torment that ensures someone is always providing audio evidence of institutional failure. Just when one voice gives out from exhaustion or unconsciousness, another picks up the awful chorus from a different ward, different corridor, different corner of this maze of human misery. Dr. Pemberton appears for his afternoon rounds with the cheerful demeanor of someone who either can't hear the screaming or has learned to tune it out, like background music. "How are we feeling today?" he asks with genuine enthusiasm, apparently unaware that his question is being accompanied by sounds that would make professional torturers reconsider their career choices. Your attempt to ask about the screaming is met with Dr. Pemberton's patient smile and a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Nothing to concern yourself with," he assures you, making a note in your file that probably reads something like, "Patient shows inappropriate interest in routine therapeutic procedures in other wards." The fact that you're disturbed by what sounds like systematic torture apparently indicates a problem with your priorities rather than a reasonable response to horrifying circumstances. The screaming creates its own rhythm and patterns that you begin to recognize, despite your best efforts not to. There's the morning screamer, who typically starts around 8 and continues until exhaustion or medication silences them around 10. The afternoon screamer usually begins their contribution around 2 and maintains impressive vocal stamina until evening meals. The night screamer, the worst of all, starts after lights out and continues sporadically until dawn, ensuring that sleep becomes impossible for anyone within a quarter-mile radius. Your fellow patients develop their own theories about the source and meaning of the screaming, creating a mythology of suffering that helps them process what they're experiencing. Some believe it's part of the treatment process. That screaming indicates therapeutic breakthrough rather than breakdown. Others think it's punishment for patients who violated asylum rules. A few whisper that it's the sound of people going genuinely mad, crossing some invisible line from which there's no return. The truly disturbing realization is how quickly you adapt to the screaming, just as you've adapted to everything else in this place. What initially felt like an assault on your sanity becomes ambient noise that you learn to function around. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, even when what you're adapting to is the systematic destruction of other human beings. The staff's response to the screaming reveals the asylum's fundamental philosophy about patient welfare. They don't rush to help, they don't investigate the source, and they certainly don't seem concerned about the psychological impact on other patients. The screaming is treated like weather, an environmental condition that everyone has to endure rather than a problem that might be solved. Your attempts to offer comfort to fellow patients who are disturbed by the screaming are carefully observed and recorded by the ever-present attendants. Patient shows inappropriate emotional responses to routine institutional sounds, reads one report. Suggests possible identification with disruptive elements rather than therapeutic community. Your natural human empathy has become evidence of psychological dysfunction. The periods of false calm become more precious and more dangerous as you learn to recognize them. When the screaming stops, when the asylum falls quiet, you find yourself holding your breath and waiting for the next assault on everyone's sanity. The quiet becomes a form of psychological torture in itself, creating anticipation that's almost worse than the actual screaming. But the most disturbing aspect of the screaming isn't the noise itself, it's the way it makes you grateful for smaller torments. When someone's being systematically broken down the corridor, your own daily suffering seems manageable by comparison. The asylum has created a hierarchy of misery where your position near the bottom feels like a privilege rather than a tragedy. The screaming also serves as a constant reminder that your current situation, however unbearable, could always get worse. Every time you think you've reached the limits of what human beings can endure, the sounds from other wards suggest that there are deeper levels of suffering waiting for anyone who draws the wrong kind of attention from the staff. Medical students who visit during particularly vocal periods are given explanations about therapeutic crisis management and breakthrough emotional expression, as if the screaming were a positive development rather than evidence of systematic abuse. The sounds of human beings being broken are reframed as educational opportunities for future doctors who will presumably perpetuate the same system of institutionalized torture. Your sleep, when it's possible, becomes populated by dreams where the screaming continues even in your unconscious mind. The sounds have invaded your psychological landscape so completely that even rest offers no escape from the audio evidence of what this place does to people. You wake up uncertain whether the screaming you remember was real or imagined, only to have your question answered by the next shift of asylum vocalists. The realization that you might one day become one of the screamers creates a special form of terror that goes beyond ordinary fear. You begin monitoring your own emotional state for signs that you're approaching whatever invisible line separates the observers from the participants in the asylum's symphony of suffering. But even this systematic assault on your psychological equilibrium is just preparation for the next phase of your asylum education, because the Victorian institutional system has some very specific ideas about what happens when patients try to explain themselves, defend their sanity, or maintain their dignity in an environment designed to strip away everything that makes them human. 12. You try to explain yourself, which only makes it worse. After weeks of systematic degradation, you finally reach your breaking point and commit the ultimate asylum sin. You try to defend yourself with logic, armed with nothing but reasonable arguments, and the foolish belief that truth might actually matter. You approach Mrs. Grimsby during her morning rounds and make the catastrophic mistake of saying, "I don't belong here." The words hang in the air like a confession of guilt at a witch trial. Mrs. Grimsby's pen stops moving across her clipboard, and her expression shifts from routine administrative boredom to the kind of interest that suggests you've just provided her with entertainment for the entire week. Victorian Asylum philosophy operated on the principle that anyone who claimed to be sane was by definition demonstrating their insanity. It was a perfectly circular system that made logical defense impossible. Sane people, they reasoned, wouldn't need to defend their sanity. Therefore, anyone who defended their sanity was clearly mad. The logic was impeccable if you ignored basic reasoning, human psychology, and common sense. "Don't belong here," she repeats, as if you've just claimed to be the Queen of England in disguise. Well, that's what they all say, isn't it? She makes a note that you know will become part of your permanent record, probably something along the lines of patient displays, classic denial patterns, and delusional self-assessment, consistent with advanced institutional resistance. Your attempt to explain your situation rationally only digs you deeper into the hole you're trying to climb out of. "I was brought here by mistake," you continue, apparently believing that facts might penetrate the fortress of institutional certainty. "There's been some kind of error in my case. Each word you speak is being recorded as additional evidence of your delusional thinking and your dangerous refusal to accept professional medical assessment. The more rationally you speak, the more evidence you provide of your supposed rationalization and manipulation." Victorian medical theory held that the most dangerous patients were those who could present logical arguments for their sanity, because this demonstrated a level of cunning that made them particularly hazardous to institutional order. Clear thinking wasn't evidence of mental health, it was proof of how cleverly your madness had disguised itself. Mrs. Grimsby nods with the patient understanding of someone who's heard this particular delusion countless times before. "Of course, there's been a mistake, love," she agrees with condescending sympathy. "And I suppose Dr. Pemberton doesn't know his business. And the magistrate who signed your commitment papers was having a laugh. And your family who brought you here were just being spiteful for no reason whatsoever." Your fellow patients observe your attempted self-defense with expressions ranging from sympathy to horror. They've learned through bitter experience that explaining yourself to the staff is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline-soaked rags. Bertram actually stops his sealing conversation to shake his head sadly at your tactical error, apparently recognizing a doomed strategy when he sees one. Dr. Pemberton arrives for his daily rounds, just as you're reaching the crescendo of your logical explanation, catching you in the act of what he'll later describe as classic presentation of paranoid ideation, with grandiose overtones. Your reasonable tone and coherent arguments aren't evidence that you might actually be sane. They're symptoms of a particularly sophisticated form of madness that requires immediate intervention. Your attempt to describe the circumstances that led to your commitment becomes a case study in how reasonable explanations can be reinterpreted as delusional thinking. Every detail you provide is analyzed for evidence of distorted perception, paranoid ideation, or grandiose self-concept. The fact that your story makes sense becomes proof of how elaborately your mind has constructed its false reality. "Ah, the silent one has found their voice," Dr. Pemberton observes with the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical predictions are being confirmed by empirical evidence. "And what fascinating delusions we're expressing today." He settles in to listen to your explanation with the attentiveness of a naturalist, observing an interesting specimen of mental illness in its natural habitat. Notice how the patient has created a comprehensive delusional system, Dr. Pemberton explains to his medical students, who scribble frantically while you're standing right there listening to yourself being discussed, like a particularly interesting museum exhibit. Observe the logical consistency of the fabricated narrative. This indicates advanced systematized paranoia rather than simple confusion. Your emotional response to being analyzed like a laboratory specimen only provides additional diagnostic material. Show frustration, and you're displaying inappropriate anger consistent with paranoid personality structure. Remain calm, and you're demonstrating pathological emotional control, indicating possible sociopathic tendencies. Cry, and you're exhibiting manipulative emotional displays designed to elicit sympathy and avoid accountability. The medical students ask questions about your case that treat your presence as irrelevant to the discussion of your own mental state. What therapeutic interventions would be appropriate for this type of delusional presentation? Asks one, apparently unaware that the person they're discussing is standing right there with opinions about their own treatment needs. Your attempt to provide context for your behavior, explaining that anyone would be upset under these circumstances, is interpreted as patient shows inability to accept responsibility for their condition and continues to blame external factors for internal psychological dysfunction. The Victorian medical establishment had created a system where normal responses to abnormal situations were pathologized as evidence of mental illness. The more articulate your explanation becomes, the more dangerous you appear to the institutional system. Patients who could express themselves clearly were considered particularly threatening because they might influence other inmates or convince visiting officials that mistakes had been made. Your ability to communicate effectively isn't evidence of mental health, it's proof of how cleverly your madness has adapted to institutional expectations. Dr. Pemberton makes extensive notes about your elaborate delusional justification system and recommends increasing your treatment regimen to address this new development. Patient requires intensive intervention to address deeply embedded denial patterns. He writes, apparently believing that refusing to accept their diagnosis is itself a symptom requiring medical treatment. Your fellow patients whisper warnings about the consequences of trying to explain yourself to the staff. Should have kept quiet, Martha observes sadly. Now they know you're a talker. That's worse than being a screamer sometimes. Her words carry the weight of experience that comes from watching other patients make the same tactical error you've just committed. The attendants begin treating you with increased suspicion following your outburst of rationality. Every subsequent interaction is filtered through their new understanding of you as someone who uses logic as a weapon against institutional authority. Your requests for basic necessities are now viewed as manipulative attempts to establish special status within the patient hierarchy. Your attempt to write a letter to someone outside the asylum is intercepted and becomes additional evidence of your delusional thinking. Patient continues to believe external parties will validate their distorted self-perception, notes the attendant who confiscates your correspondence. Recommend continued isolation from potentially reinforcing outside contacts. The other patients begin to distance themselves from you following your attempted self-defense, recognizing that association with someone who challenges the system might make them targets for increased scrutiny. Your social support network, such as it was, dissolves as people prioritize their own survival over solidarity with someone who's marked themselves as a troublemaker. Dr. Pemberton uses your case as a teaching example during medical lectures, describing how patients with this type of systematized delusional structure often present as remarkably coherent and rational, making them particularly dangerous to institutional stability and therapeutic progress. Your humanity has been transformed into a case study that will be used to train future doctors in recognizing the signs of supposedly sophisticated madness. The irony becomes clear as your situation deteriorates following your attempt to improve it through rational explanation. The asylum system has created an environment where defending your sanity is proof of insanity, where logical thinking is evidence of delusional thought patterns, and where articulate self-advocacy is interpreted as manipulative behavior that requires additional treatment. The realization that explanation is not only futile but actively harmful creates a new form of psychological pressure that goes beyond ordinary helplessness. You're trapped in a system where defending yourself makes your situation worse, where logic is evidence of irrationality, and where the very act of claiming sanity proves insanity. It's a catch-22 that would make Kafka weep with admiration for its completeness. But even this systematic destruction of rational discourse is just preparation for your next educational experience in Victorian asylum life. Because the institutional system has one more weapon in its arsenal of human degradation, the visiting physician, whose confidence in his own brilliance is matched only by his complete ignorance of what it means to be treated like a human being, rather than a fascinating specimen of mental pathology. Your file grows thicker with observations about your defensive verbalization patterns and elaborate rationalization systems, creating a paper trail that will follow you through the asylum system like a criminal record. Every word you spoke in your own defense has been documented as evidence of your mental illness, creating a feedback loop where trying to prove your sanity becomes proof of your madness. 13. You'd get lectured by a doctor who thinks he's a genius. Dr. Reginald Thornbury arrives at Bethlehem with the fanfare typically reserved for visiting royalty, complete with an entourage of fawning assistants and enough medical equipment to stock a small hospital. He's what the Victorian medical establishment calls a specialist in alienistic medicine, which is rather like calling someone a specialist in unicorn grooming, impressive-sounding credentials for expertise in something that doesn't actually exist. The man himself is a walking advertisement for Victorian medical confidence, sporting a magnificent beard that's been waxed into submission and a pocket watch that he consults with the frequency of someone timing Olympic sprinting events. His reputation precedes him like the smell of expensive cologne mixed with academic arrogance. And he's come to Bethlehem to demonstrate his revolutionary new theories about mental illness treatment. You're selected as one of his demonstration cases, an honor roughly equivalent to being chosen as the guest of honor at your own execution. Mrs. Grimsby presents you to Dr. Thornbury with the pride of someone showing off a particularly interesting specimen of taxidermy. This is the silent one, she announces, as if your label were your full legal name. Classic case of stubborn resistance with underlying hysteria. Dr. Thornbury examines you with the intensity of someone appraising a racehorse, noting your posture, complexion, and facial expressions in a leather-bound journal that probably cost more than most people's annual income. Fascinating, he murmurs, apparently finding something deeply significant in the way you breathe. Notice the defensive positioning of the shoulders and the suspicious eye movement patterns, classic presentations of moral insanity masked by superficial rationality. Victorian medical education had produced a generation of doctors who possessed unlimited confidence in their ability to diagnose mental illness through brief observation, despite having no actual training in human psychology, beyond reading theoretical treatises written by other doctors with equally limited experience. It was the blind leading the blind, if the blind were convinced they had supernatural vision and the authority to lock people up based on their insights. Dr. Thornbury begins his lecture with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believes he's about to share revolutionary medical knowledge with his captive audience. The modern alienist must understand that mental derangement manifests through observable physical characteristics, he proclaims, gesturing toward you like a professor pointing at a blackboard. The trained eye can detect madness through careful analysis of cranial features, behavioral presentations, and vocal patterns. The assembled medical students hang on his every word with the devotion of disciples receiving wisdom from a prophet, apparently unaware that they're listening to elaborate theories about human behavior from someone whose actual experience with human beings is limited to brief clinical observations. Dr. Thornbury has built his reputation on the ability to sound authoritative while discussing subjects he fundamentally doesn't understand. Observe the patient's response to direct questioning, Dr. Thornbury instructs, then proceeds to ask you a series of questions designed to demonstrate his diagnostic brilliance. "What is your name?" he begins, apparently believing that this represents sophisticated psychological assessment. When you answer normally, he nods sagely and makes notes about your calculated presentation of false normalcy. Your attempts to respond honestly to his questions become evidence of various psychological pathologies that Dr. Thornbury identifies with the confidence of someone reading from a medical textbook. Answer too quickly, and you're displaying manic responsiveness, indicating underlying emotional instability. Answer slowly, and you're showing calculated delay patterns suggesting deceptive intent. There's literally no way to respond that won't be interpreted as evidence of mental illness. Dr. Thornbury's questioning reveals the Victorian medical establishment's fascinating approach to psychological assessment, which combined profound ignorance with unlimited self-confidence. "Tell me about your family," he commands, apparently believing that family relationships provide diagnostic insights into mental health. When you describe normal family dynamics, he interprets this as idealized family construction, suggesting disconnection from reality. The questions continue with the relentless persistence of someone who's convinced that the right inquiry will unlock the secrets of your supposed madness. "What are your thoughts on marriage?" he asks, apparently believing that attitudes toward matrimony reveal deep psychological truths. "Do you experience unusual dreams?" he continues, treating normal human dream experiences as potential evidence of mental derangement. Your description of perfectly ordinary life experiences becomes raw material for Dr. Thornbury's theoretical framework, which treats normal human behavior as symptom clusters requiring professional interpretation. Note how the patient describes routine activities he tells his students, while displaying subtle indicators of underlying delusional thinking patterns. Your sanity has become the foundation for his theories about insanity. Dr. Thornbury's physical examination combines the worst aspects of medical science with the theoretical foundations of Victorian pseudoscience. He measures your skull with calipers, apparently believing that intelligence and personality traits can be determined through cranial geometry. The measurements are recorded with scientific precision and interpreted through theoretical frameworks that would make astrology seem rigorous by comparison. Remarkable cranial development in the areas associated with stubbornness and moral resistance, he announces, as if your skull were a topographical map of character, combined with underdevelopment in regions governing submission to authority and acceptance of proper social relationships. He's essentially reading your personality from the bumps on your head, using techniques that were questionable when they were invented and are completely ridiculous now. The examination continues with Dr. Thornbury testing your reflexes, measuring your pulse, and observing your respiratory patterns, as if these physical functions provided insights into your mental state. Note the elevated heart rate in response to examination, he observes, apparently unaware that being examined by someone who considers you mentally defective might naturally cause anxiety in anyone with functioning survival instincts. Dr. Thornbury's treatment recommendations flow from his examination with the inevitability of water running downhill. This patient requires intensive intervention, combining moral treatment with physical regulation, he declares, using terminology that sounds medical but actually means whatever he wants it to mean. "I recommend increased hydrotherapy, moral instruction, and therapeutic labor designed to rebuild character structure." The medical students scribble notes about Dr. Thornbury's assessment with the enthusiasm of people copying down the secrets of the universe, apparently convinced they're learning cutting-edge medical techniques, rather than witnessing an elaborate performance of professional incompetence. Your humanity has been reduced to a teaching example for future doctors who will presumably apply the same theoretical frameworks to other unfortunate patients. Dr. Thornbury's confidence in his diagnostic abilities is matched only by his complete inability to recognize that his assessments are based on nothing more substantial than personal prejudices dressed up in medical terminology. The modern alienist must trust his scientific training over superficial appearances, he explains, apparently believing that his scientific training consists of something more than reading books written by other people with equally limited experience. Your attempts to respond to Dr. Thornbury's questions honestly are interpreted through his theoretical framework in ways that transform normal human communication into evidence of pathological thinking. Notice how the patient maintains eye contact, he observes, suggesting calculated manipulation of social expectations rather than genuine engagement. Making eye contact with your doctor is apparently suspicious behavior that requires professional interpretation. The examination concludes with Dr. Thornbury delivering his final assessment with the authority of someone pronouncing judgment from on high. Classic presentation of moral insanity with systematic delusional construction, he declares, apparently satisfied that he solved the puzzle of your personality through 40 minutes of superficial observation. Prognosis guarded, requiring extended institutional intervention under careful medical supervision. Dr. Thornbury's visit demonstrates the Victorian medical establishment's remarkable ability to combine ignorance with authority, creating a system where uninformed opinions become medical diagnoses that determine people's lives. His confidence in his ability to understand human psychology through brief clinical observation would be impressive if it weren't so completely divorced from actual knowledge or experience. The medical students who witnessed Dr. Thornbury's examination leave convinced they've observed expert medical practice, prepared to apply the same theoretical frameworks to their own future patients. Your case becomes part of their medical education, teaching them that confidence and authority are more important than actual understanding or compassion in treating human beings who are struggling with mental health issues. But even this demonstration of medical arrogance disguised as scientific expertise is just another step in your ongoing asylum education. Because the Victorian institutional system has one final lesson waiting for you, a revelation about how completely you can disappear from the world outside while still being physically present, how thoroughly your identity can be erased by administrative efficiency combined with social indifference. 14. You'd realize no one knows you're here, and that's the scariest part. 6 months into your stay at Bethlehem, you make a horrifying discovery that makes all your previous sufferings seem like minor inconveniences. While sorting through the asylum's filing system during a work assignment, you find your intake documents and realize that your name has been misspelled in every single official record. You're not just institutionally invisible, you're officially a different person entirely. The clerk who processed your admission apparently decided that Smith was close enough to Smythe, and that John was interchangeable with James. These small errors have cascaded through the bureaucratic system like a slow-motion avalanche, creating a paper trail that leads to someone who shares your approximate identity but isn't actually you. You've been transformed from a real person into a filing mistake with a pulse. Victorian record-keeping was a marvel of inefficiency disguised as administrative precision. The asylum's filing system operated on the principle that close enough was good enough, especially when dealing with people whose opinions about their own identity were considered irrelevant. Your protests about the name discrepancy are noted as patient displays obsessive concerns about administrative details, suggesting underlying paranoid ideation about bureaucratic persecution. The implications of this discovery settle over you, like fog rolling in from the Thames. Your family, assuming they're still looking for you, would be searching for someone whose name doesn't match the asylum's records. Legal authorities, if they existed and cared, would find no trace of your commitment, because you've been filed under an identity that doesn't belong to you. You've been erased from existence by nothing more than clerical incompetence and institutional indifference. Mrs. Grimsby's response to your discovery demonstrates the asylum's sophisticated approach to record-keeping problems. Names are just labels, aren't they? She observes with the philosophical detachment of someone who's never had her identity accidentally deleted by administrative error. You're still the same person, regardless of what we call you. The fact that being the same person under the wrong name makes you legally non-existent, apparently doesn't warrant correction of the records. Your attempts to get the records corrected become another symptom in your ever-expanding diagnostic profile. Patient shows excessive concern with administrative procedures. Notes Dr. Pemberton, apparently believing that caring about your legal identity indicates psychological dysfunction, suggests possible grandiose delusions about personal importance requiring institutional validation. Wanting your name spelled correctly is evidence of mental illness in the Victorian Asylum system. The filing system reveals other disturbing facts about your institutional existence. Your emergency contact information leads to people who probably don't exist. Your address has been transcribed incorrectly, and your commitment papers reference legal proceedings that may or may not have actually occurred. You've been processed through a system that treats accuracy as optional and human identity as negotiable. The asylum's correspondence records show that no one has inquired about your welfare since your admission, but this might be because no one knows where to find you. Letters addressed to John Smith wouldn't reach James Smythe, and even if they did, the asylum's policy of screening patient mail means they might never be delivered anyway. You've been placed in a communication black hole where information goes in but nothing comes out. Other patients share similar stories of administrative abandonment that would be comic if they weren't so devastating. Bertram was committed under 3 different names in 3 different sets of records, creating a bureaucratic identity crisis that makes his conversations with imaginary friends seem like models of clarity. Martha's records show that she died 2 years ago, though she's obviously still alive and working in the asylum laundry. The realization that you might be completely forgotten by the outside world creates a new form of psychological terror that goes beyond ordinary isolation. You're not just separated from your previous life, you've been administratively deleted from it. The asylum hasn't just imprisoned your body, it's erased your legal existence with the casual efficiency of someone correcting a typo. Your work assignment in the records room provides glimpses into the asylum's broader approach to human bookkeeping. Files are misfiled, destroyed, or simply lost with alarming frequency. Patient records are mixed up so thoroughly that some people are receiving medications prescribed for entirely different individuals. The system operates on the principle that if something is written down, it must be true, regardless of whether it bears any relationship to reality. The visiting inspector who arrives for his quarterly review demonstrates the effectiveness of the asylum's record-keeping system. He spends 15 minutes reviewing files that bear no resemblance to the actual conditions or people they're supposed to document, then declares himself satisfied with the institution's administrative efficiency. The paper trail has become more important than the people it's supposed to track. Your family, assuming they still care about your welfare, would face insurmountable obstacles in trying to locate you. The asylum's records show no trace of your actual identity, making legal intervention impossible, even if someone were motivated to attempt it. You've been disappeared by bureaucratic incompetence more effectively than any police state could manage through deliberate oppression. The asylum's policy of limiting patient contact with the outside world means that even if someone were looking for you, they'd have difficulty gaining access to information about your status. Visiting privileges are restricted to people who can prove their relationship to patients, but how do you prove a relationship to someone whose identity has been bureaucratically altered? The system has created a perfect catch-22 that ensures institutional isolation. Your attempts to write letters to people from your previous life are hampered by the name discrepancy that makes your correspondence look like it's coming from a stranger. Even if the letters were delivered, recipients might assume they're receiving mail intended for someone else. Your own signature has become evidence of identity confusion rather than proof of your actual identity. The asylum's legal status makes challenging your commitment nearly impossible, even under the best circumstances, but the name discrepancy adds an additional layer of complexity that would challenge professional lawyers. How do you file legal papers on behalf of someone who doesn't officially exist? The bureaucratic errors have created a legal maze that effectively prevents any form of outside intervention. Dr. Pemberton uses your concern about the records as evidence of your deteriorating mental state. Patient shows increasing preoccupation with administrative details. He notes, apparently believing that caring about your legal identity indicates a dangerous disconnection from reality. Suggests possible paranoid ideation about institutional persecution requiring increased therapeutic intervention. Wanting to exist legally is now a symptom requiring treatment. The other patients begin to avoid you after your discovery about the records, recognizing that association with someone who questions the system's fundamental competence might make them targets for increased scrutiny. Your social isolation within the asylum deepens as people distance themselves from someone who's reminded them how easily they could be completely forgotten by the world outside. The night attendant who works the records room shares information about the asylum's broader approach to documentation. Half these files are complete rubbish, he admits during a quiet moment, apparently unaware that his casual revelation represents a systematic destruction of human identity on an industrial scale. But who's going to check? Nobody cares what happens to you lot once you're in here. The realization that you've been effectively erased from existence creates a new form of despair that goes beyond ordinary hopelessness. You're not just trapped in an asylum, you're trapped in a bureaucratic limbo where your identity has been dissolved by administrative indifference. Even if you somehow escaped, you'd have difficulty proving who you are to a world that has no record of your actual existence. Your file continues to grow with observations about your deteriorating mental state and increasing paranoid ideation, creating a paper trail that documents your supposed psychological decline while ignoring the reasonable causes for your distress. The asylum has created a self-fulfilling prophecy where caring about your legal existence is interpreted as evidence of mental illness that justifies continued institutionalization. The final insult comes when you discover that your next of kin contact information in the records leads to people who never existed in the first place. Someone has simply made up names and addresses to complete the paperwork, creating fictional relatives who will never inquire about your welfare because they exist only as bureaucratic conveniences designed to satisfy administrative requirements. The asylum's financial records provide another glimpse into your institutional status, revealing that someone has been paying for your care under the wrong name for months. The payments arrive regularly from sources that may or may not exist, processed through a system that doesn't verify the identity of either the patient or the person paying the bills. You've become a profitable fictional character, generating real income for the asylum. Your work assignment in the filing room reveals that record-keeping errors aren't accidental. They're systematic features of an institution that operates more efficiently when patients can't be easily traced or contacted by outside parties. Missing files, altered names, and fictional contact information serve the asylum's interests by making external oversight nearly impossible. The errors aren't mistakes, they're features of a system designed to make people disappear. The visiting chaplain who arrives for monthly spiritual guidance demonstrates the effectiveness of the asylum's invisibility system. He reads prayers over patients whose names don't match their actual identities, offering comfort to fictional people while the real individuals remain unacknowledged. Even God, apparently, is receiving the wrong information about who you are and why you're suffering. Your realization that you've been effectively deleted from the world outside creates a psychological crisis that goes beyond ordinary institutional adjustment. You're not just separated from your previous life, you've been bureaucratically erased from it. The asylum hasn't just changed your circumstances, it's changed your identity, your legal status, and your very existence in the world of official records. The night brings new terrors as you lie awake, contemplating the full implications of your discovery. Your family might have stopped looking for you, not because they don't care, but because there's no official trace of where you've gone. Friends might assume you've moved away or died, never imagining that you're living under a different name in an institution that has no record of your actual identity. The morning brings no relief from these realizations, only the continuation of institutional life under an identity that isn't yours. You eat breakfast as James Smythe, receive medication prescribed for James Smythe, and participate in work assignments scheduled for James Smythe, while your actual self becomes increasingly theoretical, even in your own mind. But even this systematic erasure of your legal and social existence is just preparation for the final and most devastating phase of your asylum education, because the Victorian institutional system has one last lesson to teach you about how the human mind responds when subjected to prolonged systematic assault on its sense of reality, identity, and hope for escape from circumstances that have moved beyond mere suffering into the realm of existential horror. 15, you'd start wondering if maybe you are going mad. 8 months into your stay at Bethlehem, you catch yourself having a conversation with the stain on your dormitory wall. Not because you believe the stain can respond, but because it's the only entity in this place that hasn't tried to diagnose, categorize, or systematically break down your sense of reality. The stain just exists, brown and irregular, shaped vaguely like a map of somewhere you'll never visit again. This is the moment you realize that the asylum has achieved its ultimate victory, not through their treatments, their surveillance, or their systematic dehumanization, but through the simple passage of time in an environment designed to make sanity impossible to maintain. You're beginning to question the very foundations of your own mind, wondering if perhaps everyone else has been right all along. The human psyche, it turns out, isn't designed to withstand prolonged exposure to institutional gaslighting combined with social isolation, systematic humiliation, and the complete absence of normal human validation. Even the strongest minds begin to crack under pressure that's applied consistently over months of carefully orchestrated psychological assault disguised as medical treatment. You find yourself checking and rechecking your memories, uncertain whether things you remember actually happened, or whether they're products of a mind that's finally succumbing to the pressures that have been applied to it with Victorian efficiency. Did you really have a life outside this place? Or is that just an elaborate fantasy your brain has constructed to protect itself from the reality of your situation? The other patients begin to look different to you now, not like fellow victims of institutional abuse, but like people who've accepted truths about themselves that you're still too stubborn to acknowledge. Bertram's conversations with the ceiling start to make a different kind of sense. Perhaps he's not delusional, but simply more honest about the nature of reality than you've been willing to admit. Your reflection in the asylum's mirrors shows someone you barely recognize, gaunt and hollow-eyed, wearing institutional clothing that hangs on a frame that seems to be disappearing a little more each day. The person looking back at you doesn't look like someone who belongs in the outside world. They look like someone who belongs exactly where they are. Victorian asylum design was accidentally brilliant in its ability to create psychological pressure that accumulated over time like interest on a debt that could never be repaid. Every aspect of institutional life was designed to reinforce the message that you belonged here, that your protests were evidence of illness, and that accepting your situation was the first step toward whatever passed for recovery in this place. The daily routine that once felt oppressive now provides a structure that you depend on for maintaining any sense of time or purpose. Wake up, eat the terrible food, perform meaningless labor, endure various forms of treatment, try to sleep despite the screaming from other wards. The routine has become your reality, and you begin to panic when it's disrupted by changes in schedule or staffing. Your memories of the outside world start to feel abstract and unreal, like stories someone told you about, places that might exist, but probably don't. The specific details fade first: faces, names, addresses, followed by the emotional connections that made those memories meaningful. Your previous life begins to feel like something that happened to someone else, or possibly something you imagined during a particularly vivid dream. Dr. Pemberton notices the change in your demeanor with the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical predictions are being confirmed by empirical evidence. The silent one is showing signs of therapeutic progress, he notes during his weekly rounds. Patient displays decreased resistance to institutional structure and reduced delusional ideation about external circumstances. Your psychological breakdown is being interpreted as medical improvement. The medical students who observe your condition use terminology that sounds clinical but essentially describes the systematic destruction of your personality through prolonged institutional pressure. Note the patient's improved compliance with therapeutic routines. Observes 1, apparently unaware that compliance achieved through psychological exhaustion isn't the same as genuine cooperation or mental health improvement. Your conversations with other patients become increasingly difficult as you find yourself unable to relate to their concerns about life outside the asylum. When Martha talks about her family, you nod politely but can't quite understand why she still cares about people who exist in a world that feels increasingly fictional. When Cornelius discusses his escape plans, you wonder why anyone would want to leave a place where everything is predictable and structured. The asylum's treatment methods begin to seem reasonable rather than torturous, not because they've improved, but because your standards for what constitutes acceptable treatment have deteriorated along with your sense of personal worth. The ice-cold baths feel refreshing rather than punishing. The meaningless labor feels purposeful because it gives you something to do with your hands while your mind processes its ongoing dissolution. Your attempts to maintain intellectual engagement through reading become increasingly unsuccessful as your concentration deteriorates and your ability to process complex information diminishes. The books that once provided escape from institutional reality now seem irrelevant to your current circumstances. Why read about places and people that don't exist when you could focus on the immediate reality of asylum life? The night terrors that once felt like symptoms of trauma begin to feel like accurate representations of reality. Perhaps the screaming from other wards isn't evidence of systematic abuse, but simply the sound of people learning to accept truths about themselves that you're still trying to avoid. Perhaps your fear isn't reasonable caution, but stubborn resistance to therapeutic intervention. Your sense of time becomes increasingly unreliable as days blend into weeks and weeks disappear into months without meaningful markers to distinguish one period from another. You begin to lose track of how long you've been here, whether it's been months or years, and eventually whether it matters at all. Time becomes a theoretical concept rather than something that affects your daily experience. The asylum's labeling system starts to feel accurate rather than arbitrary. Perhaps you really are the silent one, and your previous identity was the delusion rather than your current institutional existence. The label begins to feel comfortable, like clothing that's been worn long enough to conform to your body's shape. You stop correcting people who use your asylum nickname and begin introducing yourself by your institutional identity. Your physical health deteriorates along with your psychological condition, but you interpret this as evidence that your body is finally accepting its proper role rather than fighting against appropriate institutional care. The weight loss makes you feel more authentic somehow, as if your previous healthy appearance was a disguise that hid your true nature as someone who belongs in this place. The other patients begin to treat you differently as your transformation becomes apparent, not with the camaraderie of shared suffering, but with the recognition that you've crossed some invisible line into institutional acceptance. You've become one of the permanent residents rather than someone who's temporarily experiencing asylum life while waiting for rescue or release. Dr. Pemberton prescribes additional treatments. Now that you're showing therapeutic responsiveness apparently, believing that your psychological surrender indicates readiness for more intensive intervention. The treatments feel different now, not like torture disguised as medicine, but like necessary adjustments to help you adapt to your proper role in the institutional hierarchy. Your family, assuming they ever existed and cared about your welfare, have probably accepted your absence by now and adjusted their lives to function without you. The thought doesn't cause the sharp pain it once did, but feels like a natural resolution to relationships that were probably based on mutual delusion. People move on, circumstances change, and clinging to the past is simply evidence of an unhealthy resistance to accepting reality. The realization that you might actually belong here, that perhaps everyone who brought you to this place saw something in you that you were too self-deluded to recognize, settles over your consciousness like fog rolling across the Thames. It doesn't feel like defeat, it feels like clarity, like finally seeing yourself as you really are, rather than maintaining elaborate fantasies about who you thought you were. The asylum has achieved its ultimate victory, not through breaking your spirit, but by convincing you that your spirit was never worth preserving in the first place. You've been transformed from someone who was wrongly institutionalized into someone who belongs exactly where they are, and the transformation feels less like loss than like coming home to a truth you've been avoiding your entire life. The Victorian Asylum system's greatest achievement wasn't treating mental illness. It was creating mental illness in people who arrived with manageable problems and transforming them into individuals who genuinely needed institutional care. They'd perfected a form of psychological alchemy that turned human gold into institutional lead, and you've become their masterpiece of therapeutic transformation. You are, finally and completely, exactly what they said you were from the beginning. The silent one, a patient, someone who belongs here. And the most terrifying part isn't that they've broken you, it's that you're grateful they have.